stacked up against the far wall. He looked at the sampler hung above the bed, Jesus in a circular field with a herd of stray sheep. The embroidery was amateur, but there was something unsettling rather than comforting about the lone figure silhouetted against the hill, his face caught in the process of turning away. And then he looked closer. Initially, he'd thought the figure was Jesus, but as he examined it carefully, he saw that it depicted another face. It was a face he knew. A cold tremor ran down his back. His breath stammered in his throat. The face of the man in the sampler was the same face as that of the statue behind the pricket stand next to the seat of the fire. Carrigan snapped several photos of the sampler. He turned from the image and approached the bookcase. Books and pamphlets had been jammed into every available space. He looked through the titles and saw books on the Bible, exegesis, commentaries, books on politics, and memoirs of mystics and prophets. Many of the books were in Latin or Spanish. He took close-up photographs of spines and titles for Geneva to examine. Each book he knew would have to be meticulously looked through, sifted and examined and sniffed and rubbed to see if it would give up its secrets. He left the bookcase and scanned every remaining inch of the room, the bare floor, the walls, under the mattress, the crevices between bed and corner, but there was nothing else, and he felt a wave of disappointment as he realised this room might not have been used for years. His eyes crinkled as the emergency lights stuttered and blinked outside. He briefly wondered if they were connected to a generator or battery and knew he might not have long before they went out completely. He'd left the bedside table for last. It was a single wooden piece, nothing antique or fancy about it, a purely functional object with one large compartment and a smaller drawer above. There was a thin layer of dust coating the surface. No disturbances that would indicate something had been sitting on the table then taken away. No fingerprints or smudge marks. The main compartment was empty apart from what looked like mouse droppings in the corner, but the drawer contained a Bible and a crucifix. He pulled his gloves tighter so they wouldn't snag against the wood and lifted both items carefully out of the drawer. The light stuttered outside, and he turned his torch back on and aimed it at the crucifix. The detail on the figure was astonishing, and Carrigan could see the individual veins in Jesus' arms, the fingernails on his impaled hand, the snarled lips revealing white teeth, a single tear rolling down his wooden cheek. He took out an evidence bag from his pocket and bagged the crucifix. The Bible was old and covered in cracked red leather. Its animal smell seemed alien in this antiseptic room, and he brought it a little closer to his nose, enjoying the warm, familiar scent. It seemed an ordinary Bible, and he quickly turned to the front, but there were no personalizations or family history inscribed in it. He flicked through the pages, hoping something would fall out, a scrap of paper, a hidden snapshot, but there was nothing but dust. He left it for the sockos, then turned back to inspect the door mechanism. There was a small lever about halfway up the wall. He cranked the lever and saw the cogs and pulleys shift, lurch and lock. Whoever had stayed here had not been a prisoner. He took one last look at the room, then crouched down and rolled through the narrow opening. He was almost all the way out when a stray hair caught on one of the springs, and he let out a sharp exhalation as he felt it tear away from his scalp. He got to his feet on the other side of the door, massaging his head, and then he quickly got back down, poking his flashlight into the opening. His hair had been snagged by one of the levers on his way out. It was probably an occupational hazard of moving through this constricted space. He leaned further in, aiming the light into the skeletal mechanism, probing the cracks and shadows. He only noticed it because of its colour, so startling in that murky darkness, and it took him a few seconds before he realised he had been holding his breath. He stared at it, unable to trust his own eyes. He took out his phone and snapped a photo of the single strand of hair. It was about 3 inches long, fine and slightly curled, and it was a bright, shocking pink, the colour of candy floss or a young girl's lipstick. It was caught between 2 cogs, and he gently pulled the hair from its place, careful not to snag or break it, and eased it into an evidence bag. He held up the bag and stared at it. The length and colour indicated that it was probably female. Best of all, it looked like the root was still attached. The Sockos might be able to get a DNA print off it. He was thinking about this and the caretaker's description of the new girl when the lights went off. The basement was plunged into darkness. Carrigan snapped his head up and got to his feet, keeping his torch shielded. He placed the evidence bag in his jacket pocket and wondered where the battery for the lights was and whether there was a backup he could engage so that he could further investigate the hidden room. But then he heard the unmistakable creak of the floorboards above him and knew that someone else was in the house. He slowly made his way across the basement, keeping the light dim and pointed downwards, avoiding the tombs and scattered debris, trying to make as little noise as possible. He heard nothing else from above and chided himself for having been so easily spooked. It was probably just the floorboards warping and settling as they cooled from the heat of the fire. He reached the stairs and looked up. At that exact moment, the door at the top of the staircase opened and bright white light spilt down into the basement. A man was standing at the top of the stairs, his body filling the doorframe. He seemed just as surprised to see Carrigan as Carrigan was to see him. For a moment that seemed to stretch much longer, they both stood there as if not quite believing in the other's presence. Carrigan had just time enough to note his black suit and the jagged scar pulling down one side of his mouth before the man turned and ran. Carrigan leapt up the stairs 2 at a time, his momentum such that by the time the wood broke and fell away beneath his feet, he was already onto the next one, and he knew that if he hesitated for even a fraction of a second, he would end up crashing back down into the basement. The last piece of staircase splintered and cracked as he grabbed onto the doorframe and steadied himself. He looked to his left and saw the man with the scar running down the corridor, then stopping abruptly and turning to face him. There was something strange in the man's expression, and then Carrigan watched his eyes drift, looking at something behind him. Carrigan turned and saw the other man coming towards him, swinging something in his raised arm, a gaudy eagle tattooed on his neck, and then his vision exploded in star shower and light dazzle. He waited for the floor to break his fall, but there was no floor, only the black rush of the stairs like a gaping throat, swallowing him up and folding him into darkness. Part 2. One cannot be in the world without getting a little dust on his shoulders. St. Francis of Assisi. Chapter 17. He dreamed they were together again. They were sitting on a bench in Hyde Park, watching the children play by the pond. Louise was holding his hand and whispering in his ear. Her skin was cold and dry, and he had to keep leaning closer because it was so hard to make out what she was saying. The kids were laughing and yelling, their parents chatting on mobile phones as dogs dipped their noses into the rippled water. Louise was telling him to look up at the sky. You need to look up. But he didn't want to take his eyes off her. Things he'd forgotten. The slight crinkle under her right cheek, the slope of her jaw, the way her shoulders dropped when she spoke, came rushing back to him. He saw her watching the children, one small boy walking unnoticed into the pond until he disappeared beneath the calm green water. And then he turned back and she was gone, and the children were gone, and the sun was gone. Even the grass was gone. All that was left were her shoes, Louise's shoes, lying neatly side by side on the gravel path, cracked and worn and drenched in blood. He snapped awake, his tongue dry and bitter, his heart thudding away in his chest. The sky gone, the park gone. He stared up at the sterile white ceiling, the riverine cracks and fissures, the dangling tubes and cables, and then he felt her hand, and it was warm and soft.
"You were dreaming. The doctor said the painkillers would do that."
Geneva was sitting on a stool beside the bed. Her hair was loose, falling around her neck in yellow folds, and her eyes had a funny squint to them, as if she had just emerged from a place of total darkness.
"What happened?"
He looked around the room, the white walls and beeping machines, the tubes snaking up from under the sheets, the concern darkening Geneva's face. "A neighbour saw 2 men running out of the ruins. She called us, and we found you lying on your back in the basement." He was sitting up now, the tubes gurgling and sending fluids through his system, a glass of water next to him, too cold to drink.
"What were you doing there?"
He tried to think back, and the memories rushed him like a storm, fragments and pieces coalescing into sequences and stagger frames, into things he'd rather not remember.
I wanted—"
"Never mind for now," Geneva said, and handed him the glass of water. It was still too cold, but he drank it anyway, enjoying the sudden icy shock to his mouth.
"How long have I been here?"
"Just over 36 hours. The doctor said you took quite a beating." She stopped and looked at the flowers and cards sent over by the department, each one more depressing and inappropriate than the last.
"What happened, Jack?"
The use of his first name startled him, or was it just the way she had said it? He wasn't sure. He tried talking, but his mouth felt as if it had been filled with sand, and he gulped the water greedily, half of it running down the front of his gown. He gave her a brief rundown of what he'd found in the convent, the secret room, the pink hair, and the men who had been waiting for him, the one with the eagle tattoo, and the one with the scar on his mouth. He leaned forward suddenly, his bones popping and cracking, a wave of nausea washing over him.
"My jacket!"
She put a hand on his shoulder and gently pressed him back down. "Don't worry about your clothes. The doc—" He turned, and something cracked loudly in his neck as he grabbed her wrist.
"It's not the damn clothes. There was evidence in there."
"The crucifix? Yeah, I saw that," Geneva replied. "Thought you'd gone all religious on me. Then I noticed the other bag. I sent them both to the lab. Quinn's fast-tracked it. We should get the results soon. There's also been some new developments regarding the nuns."
"What?"
"Later. You need to rest." He let go of her hand and closed his eyes, and saw the pink sky, the pregnant clouds, the eager, smiling children. But however hard he tried, he couldn't bring Louise's face back into focus.
"I need to get out of here,"
he said, raising himself from the bed, then collapsing back down as the world gave way to rushing emptiness.
"Inspector Carrigan?"
She was shaking him, but the dream refused to loosen its grip. He felt her hand, then tried to focus on the words emerging from her mouth. His eyes blinked open, and he saw the long, sad face of ACC Quinn leaning over him.
"Good to see you back in the land of the living."
Carrigan looked around, but Geneva was nowhere to be seen. He reached for his glass of water, but it was gone.
"How are you holding up?"
The ACC was attired in full dress uniform, hands planted deep in pockets, his hair slicked to the side, shiny and glossed, making it look as if it had been painted on.
"Better when I get the hell out of here."
"Yes, quite," Quinn replied. "Not the best time for the investigating officer to get himself hospitalized." Carrigan looked around, but Branch was nowhere to be seen. He wondered why the ACC was visiting him alone. Quinn kept standing, despite the fact that there was a stool right next to the bed.
"Now tell me,"
the ACC said,
"what happened in there?"
Carrigan shrugged, or at least tried to, but his shoulders felt as if they'd been crushed to dust, muscles he didn't even know existed glowing hot with needle-prick pain.
"I know you're still recovering, probably nursing a bad headache, but I'm sure you've had worse. The quicker we know what we're dealing with, the better, right?"
Carrigan managed to nod. He told Quinn about the room he'd found, the single strand of pink hair, the men.
After I heard about the cocaine in the chapel, I started wondering if maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong.
Cocaine?
Quinn repeated, his top lip trembling, his face deathly pale and bulge-eyed. Branch had obviously not updated him on this part of the investigation.
Yes.
And what exactly does this have to do with the fire? The words came out slow and measured, but there was an undertone to them that Carrigan noted.
We don't know that it does, he answered. That's why we need to investigate the convent further.
Now, Carrigan, Quinn's voice turned steely and flat. We don't want unsubstantiated rumours floating around or, God forbid, being bandied in the press. This isn't going to help us catch whoever set the fire. Are you suggesting I ignore evidence?
Carrigan tried sitting up, but the effort was too much.
You're an intelligent man. I think you know what you need to do. What I need to do is get a warrant to see the full diocese files on the Sisters of Suffering, Carrigan said, propping himself up on the bed. Something was going on at that convent. 5 of the nuns bear identical torture scars. We have reports of strange visitors when there shouldn't have been any visitors. The nuns were involved in a lot more than just prayer and good deeds. We're only beginning to scratch the surface. The chances of this being a random fire are diminishing by the day. Quinn studied him silently for a long moment, his shadow blocking all light from the window. Absolutely not, he replied. That's just the kind of thing I'm talking about, Carrigan. Being a policeman isn't only about solving cases, and you should know that by now. It's about understanding how to handle all aspects of the case. The days of steaming like a bulldozer through the victims' private lives are over. A policeman who wants to stay in the force needs to realise this. Quinn looked down at the dull and grimy floor. Perhaps it's better if you rest. I can always pass this case on to another DI. Carrigan started to say something, but the blackness came again, like a dark blanket, and this time he welcomed its arrival. He woke to the smell of coffee. He kept his eyes shut for a few seconds, in case the smell was only some stray linger from the dream. He took deep breaths, savouring the aroma, and then he heard her cough, and knew it was real. She was sitting silently on a stool beside the bed, eyes closed, her face tilted slightly towards him, and he could see the curve of her lips, the sudden fullness at the centre, a scar the shape and size of a thumbnail just below her jaw.
I wasn't sure we'd have time for that coffee later, so I thought we may as well do it now.
Karen leaned forward, and her hair spilled across her shoulders as she handed him the small hot cup of espresso, their fingers touching for a brief second. "Thank you," he said, managing to smile. They held each other's stare for a moment, her eyes fierce black orbs, her smile soft and gentle. He was still adrift on a sea of painkillers, the hard edges of the world softened into brushstrokes, and in the spilt light she looked haloed and aglow. A sudden panic flashed through his mind like black rain. Is my mother okay?" Karen smiled, her eyes crinkling into focus.
"She's fine, Jack. I've just come from upstairs. She's sleeping peacefully. That's not why I'm here."
Her accent made even the most familiar word sound exotic. Carrigan relaxed back into the bed. "I never thought I'd find myself a couple of floors down from my mother." He looked up at Karen, and all he wanted to do was fall into her life, her petty struggles, middle-of-the-night fears and small, unexpected joys, to forget his own life inside of hers. She took a sip of her coffee, her lips parting slightly.
"We never know where each moment will find us. That's why, when I heard you were here, I came straight down."
The door snapped open, and they both looked up, startled and gape-eyed, as Geneva entered the room. She took one step inside, then stopped and stared at Karen. Her gaze went over to the 2 espresso cups on Carrigan's bedside table, then back to the nurse. She blinked twice as she recognised her, and her mouth tightened into a perfect O. "No one's supposed to be in here," Geneva said. "This room is off limits." Her voice was sharp and brittle in the tiled white space. "I was just checking on him." "I can see that." Karen raised her eyebrows and looked back towards Carrigan. She shrugged her shoulders, her eyes retreating, and got up and left the room. "That wasn't very nice." Geneva looked down at the floor, her mobile clutched tightly in her right hand. "I know. I'm sorry. This fucking case." She trailed off, not wanting to say it was also the sight of him so helpless there on the bed. "Forget it," he replied. "We've got bigger things to worry about." He started to lift himself up, and when Geneva tried to say something, he cut her off. "Quinn's talking about bringing in a new DI. I need to get back to the station." Just then, the door opened, and a young, harried-looking doctor came in. He glanced sharply at Carrigan until he lay back down on the bed. The doctor didn't say a word to either of them as he went round checking the machines and making notes on the clipboard he'd taken off the end of the bed. Finally, he turned towards Carrigan. "We're going to take you down for a few more tests, I'm afraid. Shouldn't be too painful." "How long's it going to take?" The doctor was ticking something off on his clipboard and didn't look up as he answered. "A couple of hours, give or take, but there's no hurry. We want to keep you here a few more days for observation, make sure nothing permanent got damaged. You're a little overweight and rather unfit for your age, and you took quite a fall. I'll have the orderlies come for you in 10 minutes. The doctor checked Carrigan's pulse, looked under his eyelids, made a few more notes, and left. A scream came from the room next door. Carrigan looked at the tubes and clips attached to his skin, saw 2 orderlies wheeling someone down the dark, endless hallway, and started pulling the drips out of his body. "Are you sure you should be doing that?" Geneva asked. "Get my jacket," he said, ignoring the concern in her voice, "and get everyone together in the incident room. We've wasted enough time." Chapter 18. They clapped as he entered. He didn't know why they were doing this. He'd failed, after all. The probable suspects had been in his grasp, and he'd let them get the better of him. His left eye was black and swollen, and he had a square of white gauze taped to his right temple. He tried to smile, but it still hurt too much, so he nodded his head and waited for everyone to take their seats. Someone, maybe Geneva, had left a chocolate Florentine by his chair. He took a hurried bite, feeling the sugar hit, and then he began. "First of all, thank you for all this, but I fucked up. I should have called back up, and maybe we'd have those 2 in custody right now instead of this bloody headache I've got, so please, no more clapping, okay?" "We weren't clapping because you got beaten up." Carlson was rather too eager to clarify. "We just heard back from the lab. They managed to extract a sample. God knows how they did it so quickly. The DNA from the pink hair you found matches the sample the pathologist retrieved from the 11th victim. I think we can be pretty certain that the body in the confession booth is the new girl Hubbard told us about. We're running the sample through the database at the moment, but the server's on the blink as usual, so it's going to take a while." Carrigan stared at his sergeant. Was there a grudging acceptance in the man's tone? He had never got on with Carlson, or maybe it was the other way around, but there was something about this case that seemed to transgress all personal issues. "That's great," he said. "But it doesn't mean we'll necessarily be able to identify the 11th victim. It's only good to us if she's on record somewhere, so don't get your hopes up." He stopped, out of breath, a sharp, hot pain in his left side making him buckle. "Anyone talk to the Sockos about what they found in the secret room?" he said, hoping no one had noticed his momentary weakness. Singh looked up from her notes. "A lot of fingerprints, mainly overlaid and of no use to us. They said it looked like many people had stayed in the room. I did manage to identify the statue found at the seat of fire. It depicts Archbishop Oscar Romero. The painting in the secret room is of the same person. He was a famous church leader and liberation theologian in Central and South America and was assassinated in 1980.
What on earth is liberation theology?
Carlson asked. No idea, Singh replied. The Sokos also went through the bookcase in the secret room. The books had nothing unusual inside them. They're sending them over to us today, and they didn't find anything else they considered significant. The hidden room is significant, Carrigan said. Many older religious buildings have priest holes of some kind, but this one was in use. Was the girl with the pink hair staying there? And if so, why? Singh, get the blueprints for the convent, see if the room is marked on them or whether it's a later addition. There was also something that looked like a workshop along the back wall. Tools and machines and so forth. I want you to liaise with forensics over this, find out what the space was used for. It doesn't fit with the rest of the basement. He paused and looked down at his hands, then cleared his throat. We still have no idea what the cocaine was doing there, and that bothers me. He looked across the room and saw Carlson smiling to himself. You have something to share with us, Sergeant? Carlson shuffled in his chair, stretched and sat up. The nuns were hassling dealers and moving them on. Maybe they confiscated the coke off one of the dealers. It would give that someone a bloody good motive to set the fire. It seems a bit implausible, Carrigan replied, making a note in his policy book. Now, how are we doing on locating Father McCarthy? Jennings shrugged despondently. I spoke to Roger Holden, and he told me that as of yesterday, Father McCarthy is on retreat and uncontactable. On retreat, Carrigan repeated, wondering exactly what kind of game Holden was playing. Thank you, Jennings. Keep hassling the diocese. Try and find out exactly where he's staying. We need to talk to Father McCarthy. We know he was a regular visitor, and he was seen leaving the premises an hour before the fire. You think it's possible he set the fire? Jennings asked. I'm not thinking anything yet, except it's bloody curious he decided to pick this week to go on retreat. Carrigan wrote something down on the whiteboard, then turned towards Geneva. Miller, what did you find out at the diocese? Geneva ran through it point by point. It looks like Mother Angelica recruited the other nuns. 7 of them knew each other from Peru. They were all stationed there in 1973. 1973, Carrigan said. 40 years ago. Geneva nodded, and there was a momentary silence as they considered the implications of this. They also curtailed all their charity work a year ago. Before, they were involved in organising homeless shelters and youth workshops. They set up drug rehab centres and mobilised local residents in picketing known drug houses, giving out leaflets and advice to customers. Suddenly, this all stops dead a year ago. And you're assuming this has something to do with the case? Everything has something to do with the case until we rule it out. He nodded. It was something he'd taught her. OK, keep looking into that, Miller, but let's focus on what we have that's concrete. Berman, did you get anything from the school's CCTV tapes? Berman's face emerged from the bank of computer screens lining his desk. He blinked twice, like some burrowing animal unused to the light. We got lucky there. Because of previous problems with paedophiles, the school keeps all the footage archived. He stood up, taking a long black lead from his desk, and plugged it into the back of a flat-screen television mounted on the far wall. He was clumsy and uncoordinated, and it took him several tries before he got it right. The camera is angled towards the front gates of the school. The convent is 2 doors down. We can just see their driveway. Berman nervously fingered the prayer shawl he wore under his shirt and looked up at the screen as if for confirmation to carry on. The uniforms spent all night going through the footage. Take a look at this. He pressed a button on his laptop, and the TV flickered to life, revealing the front gate of the school and the gently curving road beyond. Berman fast-forwarded the tape until a black SUV drove into frame, slowed down, and disappeared at the edge of the camera's domain. "I checked the number plate. It's fake, not stolen. Made up from two separate plates as far as I can tell." He pointed to the screen. "They're parking a couple of doors down from the school, almost directly outside the convent. See how they're starting to swing in?" Berman switched to another shot. "This is a couple of weeks later. It's the same SUV, no doubt about it. Now watch this." He fast-forwarded the tape until a glimmer of black filled the bottom left-hand corner. "This time, there's already somebody else double-parked outside the convent. You can just make out the back of what looks like a Royal Mail van." He pressed play, and they all watched as the black SUV came to a stop closer to the school gates. The driver was the first one out, but his face was obscured by the top of the SUV, and he quickly walked off screen. Then the man sitting in the passenger seat opened his door. He stepped out, checked either side of him, then looked directly at the school. Carrigan stared at the frozen image of the man who had been standing at the top of the stairs. In the light, his face was raw and curiously unformed, but the scar which disfigured his mouth was unmistakable. "Thought you'd like that," Berman said, punching keys with a renewed energy. "You're going to like this even more." The image changed, and Carrigan saw that the sergeant was running the video taken at the initial crime scene, a visual record of the frantic, eager crowd who'd gathered to watch the fire. The young female constable had done a good job. There were families with kids and shopping bags, groups of teenagers swigging on cans of lager, and Middle Eastern businessmen in long, flowing white robes, everyone's eyes wide and agape, their faces freckled by flame, a reverent awe in their muted expressions. Carrigan found himself transfixed, realizing he'd never seen this footage before, watching the rapt and stunned faces as the camera moved steadily through the crowd, past the pressed huddle of bodies and flung arms and party cheer, and suddenly, there he was. The same man, 3 rows back, watching the fire and talking to another man who was partially hidden from view. "This was taken only an hour after the fire started," Berman said. He paused the video, and Carrigan stared at his assailant. The small, recessed eyes and jagged horror film scar. He got up and walked over to the screen. Everyone was silent and spooked and a little excited. Carrigan's eyes were fixed on the TV. The man who'd attacked him in the ruins had visited the convent a week before. He'd been standing outside watching the fire as it blazed. Had this man followed him to the ruins last night, or had he come there for a different purpose and just stumbled upon him? "Carlson, get Berman to run you off some stills. Focus on the scar. There can't be too many of those around. Check through the PNC database. If he's been in trouble before, it'll be in there." He walked back to the table and sat down and pulled out his policy book. "Our main focus now is getting an ID on this man. I want you to circulate the photos. See if anyone in Vice or Immigration recognises him. Send it to all patrol and watch officers." He stopped and waited for everyone to finish their frantic scribbling and was about to assign the constables their daily tasks when Carlson's computer started beeping insistently. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned towards the sergeant's desk. Carlson was staring at the screen, his face a mask of surprise. "What?" Carrigan said. "The system's back online. We've got a match." The normally deadpan sergeant looked utterly astonished as he clicked on the link, his fingers tapping impatiently against the desktop. "I don't fucking believe it," he said. "Our 11th victim has a criminal record." Chapter 19. Emily Maxted, 32 years old. Carrigan flicked through the 3 scant pages resting on his lap as Geneva drove, the cars and trees and buses whipping by his window in a smeary spray of light. Emily had been arrested in 2008 for cannabis possession. The arrest had resulted in a couple of hours in the cells and, luckily for them, a DNA sample taken from her as part of a trial program the Met had been running at the time. The sample matched both the pink hair found in the priest hole door and the degraded DNA from the corpse in the confession booth. Emily Maxted was their 11th victim. Carrigan felt his heart beat a little bit faster. As they headed north, the tight constriction of Paddington and Kilburn gave way to an unobscured sky, steep hills, and sudden unexpected views. Parkland spread out on either side, a brilliant blaze of white melting into the far horizon. Children ran across the road, clutching toboggans in mittened hands, while their parents tried to keep up. Hampers and wet, writhing dogs juggled in their arms. The snow fell in white, swirly sheets, making the world seem domed and contained, as if they were trapped inside a snow globe. Carrigan took a Kit Kat from his pocket and scored his nails down the foil, popping half of it in his mouth and closing his eyes for a moment to savour the taste. When he opened them again, he noticed Geneva watching him. "What? Is that all you're having for lunch?" He balled up the chocolate wrapper and dropped it next to his seat. "Got another one in my pocket?" She couldn't help but smile and was a little too slow to cover it up. "You know that's not what I meant." "I'll eat when the case is over," he said, unpeeling the small, faded photo from the first page of the arrest sheet and holding it between his fingers. Emily Maxted had been stunned by the flash, her eyes squinting against the sudden burst of light. But despite that, and the fact she'd just been arrested, there was something about her that would grab your attention even in a crowded room. Her skin was pale and finely textured, and it made her eyes appear unnaturally green and defiant. There was a dangerous curve to her lips, and her hair was dyed purple and hung across her forehead in a set of uneven bangs that concealed as much as they revealed. She seemed squeezed into the photo's frame, its strict parameters unable to contain her. But even in this single snapped moment, Carrigan could see a wealth of buried history lurking in her eyes, storms and resentments, and things that happened to her when she was 4 years old. He put down the photo and rechecked the address on the file, telling Geneva to take the next right. They soon entered a hidden London, spacious and pristine, folded between the rolling hills and humps of Hampstead Heath. The area looked as if the last 100 years had never happened. They drove by houses that took up a whole block, houses invisible behind 10-foot walls, and houses set so far back on their grounds they seemed mere specks on the horizon. The road curved and twisted as it followed the swirled spine of the heath, making the residences seem cut off from one another, distant ships on a jewelled sea. You could spend money to protect and seclude yourself from the harsh noise and swagger of the city, but, as they pulled into the driveway, Carrigan knew that no amount of money could spare the people inside from the news he was about to deliver. He got out of the car, brushed the crumbs from his jacket, and stretched his legs as he stared up at the imposing Palladian facade. "You ever done this before?" He turned towards Geneva, startled at how pale and drawn she looked. "Once. Only once," she replied. "Swore I'd never do it again." She laughed faintly, the sound disappearing almost as soon as it escaped her mouth. He'd been pleasantly surprised when she'd volunteered to come along. It was a necessary part of the job, but it was always ugly, and nothing would change that. It was the part everyone hated, the part where they suddenly made excuses or remembered important meetings they were late for. But Carrigan had always believed that he, as the investigating officer, should do it himself. No victim's relatives deserved a uniform 3 weeks into the job, stumbling through his lines and putting his foot in it. But it wasn't just that, he had to admit, as he stared one last time at the photo. They needed to find out as much as they could about the mysterious pink-haired girl, about her life and friends and routines, before they could understand how she was involved with the nuns and why she was there that night.
A Filipino woman, dressed in an old-fashioned black and white maid's outfit, opened the door. "We're here to see Miles and Lillian Maxted." Carrigan showed her his warrant card. The maid looked at him in alarm, staring down at the card, then back up at the man with the black eye and Frankenstein gauze. "Maria? Is everything okay?" A woman's voice came from a small speaker attached to the maid's outfit. It was the same kind of device parents use to monitor sleeping babies. The maid winced when she heard the voice, then picked up the receiver and pressed a button. "There's 2 policemen here to see you and the mister," she said in a pleasant sing-song voice. The receiver crackled briefly with static. "Well, I suppose you'd better bring them up." They followed the maid through a hallway that was like the atrium to some eccentric oil baron's private museum. Statues of Greek nymphs and Roman legionnaires were mounted in niches at regular intervals. Wood-smoked Regency chairs stood stout and wary as guard dogs. The walls were heavy with painted faces, dark, troubled portraits from another era. Every available bit of space crammed with a confusion of art. The maid knocked once on a large wooden door, then, without a word, turned and left. The woman who opened the door showed no sign of surprise when she saw them. Carrigan could tell she was far too well bred for such displays. She was one of those women whose former beauty resided just below the skin, like old paintings that still sparkled underneath the patina of years and neglect. "You'd better come in," she said, incurious and unrattled, as if they were delivering her weekly shopping. The room was overwhelming in its bounty. The Maxteds had collected so many books and artworks and knickknacks that the space seemed diminished by them, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows disappearing in a murk of haze and obstacle. There was no sense or order to the room. Indian dream catchers stood next to Greek figurines, Buddhas next to sculptures made from toothbrushes. The floors were covered with ornate Persian rugs and Turkish kilims, a riot of colour and squiggle. A series of paintings dominated the room. The image was almost the same in each one, a procession of anguished heads, eyeless, wrenched in agony, contorted by silent screams, the brushwork loose and furious. There were books on the floor and books on the piano and books teetering on the curved arms of sofas.
"What do we have here, then?"
Carrigan turned to see a man sitting in a deep black leather armchair. He wore a brown polo neck and ash-grey chinos and was holding a glass of red wine in his hand. His fingernails were manicured, outshining the glass, and his eyes possessed a deep, probing restlessness, sizing up the 2 detectives in one quick glance. "My name is Detective Inspector Carrigan." "Yes, yes." Miles Maxted rose from his chair and put down his drink on a small, ornately lacquered side table. "What do you want?" "Is your daughter Emily Maxted?" Carrigan watched the man's eyes carefully, but saw only a sharp intelligence and a wary cunning there, no sign of what lay underneath.
"What has she done this time?" Miles asked, then shook his head. "No, don't tell me. I don't want to know."
Carrigan looked over at Geneva. This wasn't turning out the way he'd planned. He took a step forward. "I'm afraid that a body, identified as Emily's, was recovered from the scene of a fire 3 days ago." He watched as the words sank in, noting any facial tick or tell. It was always the same in these situations. At first, it was as though they hadn't heard him, quickly followed by bewilderment, and then finally the realization of what lay behind the words.
"A fire?"
Miles Maxted tapped his fingernails against the side of his glass.
"What on earth are you talking about?"
Lillian Maxted was absolutely still beside her husband, a 3-inch gap separating them. She didn't say anything, but her face was pale and stretched. A grandfather clock stood sentry by the door, and its insistent ticking filled the silence.
Carrigan cleared his throat. There was a fire at a convent in Bayswater on Thursday night. I'm afraid we've identified Emily as one of the... The glass fell from Lillian's hand and shattered on the floor. She stared down at the scattered shards and quietly began to sob. Miles Maxted turned towards his wife. "Lillian, please." His voice was sharp and brusque, and his expression cold and weary, as if he had been through this kind of thing too many times to count. Lillian gathered herself together and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse. "I'm sorry," she said. There's nothing to be sorry about." Carrigan took her by the arm and gently led her towards a large red velvet armchair. As he passed Miles, he brushed against him and felt the man's taut frame beneath the silky skin of his shirt. "We're used to much worse, believe me. I'm very sorry about your daughter." Lillian slumped into the chair and snuffled, rubbing her eyes and smearing her makeup. "A convent? Are you sure?" Carrigan knelt down until their heads were level and nodded, then stared down at the floor. It had been polished so many times that the wood sparkled with an unnatural clarity, and he could almost see his own reflection in it. "We have a positive DNA match." Lillian looked up briefly, saw something in Carrigan's eyes that confirmed her worst fears, and began to cry, quickly wiping the tears away with her hand. "I always knew it would end like this." Geneva and Carrigan looked at each other as Lillian's words tumbled into incomprehensible sobs and punctured coughs. "Mrs. Maxted?" "She means Emily chose her own path," Miles said, his voice breaking slightly on the last syllable. "The path she chose was always going to end badly, Inspector. You're only confirming what we knew and feared would happen." Carrigan stared at the man, trying to figure out if it was the shock that was making him like this, or if he was like this all the time. "Mr. Maxted, we've just informed you that your daughter is dead. I think..." "You think everyone reacts in the same way?" "They usually do." "But some people don't, right? Some people don't behave like everyone else." "Yes, and that tells me quite a lot about them," Carrigan replied. He took out his notebook and pen and flipped the pages till he found a blank one. "You don't mind if I make some notes, do you? My memory's not what it used to be." Miles Maxted shrugged. "When was the last time you saw Emily?" Carrigan asked, his mouth tight, the breath locked in his chest. "We haven't seen her in nearly 2 years," Lillian said. "I'm sorry to hear that," Carrigan replied. Miles settled himself down in the armchair and poured a large measure of scotch, his hands unsteady, the whisky splashing on his sleeve, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Carrigan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The last thing he could afford to do was lose control in front of a grieving parent, but there were questions that had to be asked and leads that needed to be pursued. "You said you knew she would end up like this. Could you please explain what you meant by that?" Miles took a long, messy gulp of his drink. "I'm afraid Emily was lost to us a long time ago, Inspector. The people she hung around with, the lowlifes and bottom feeders, those crazy ideas of her. It was bound to end up like this. It was only a matter of when." Carrigan leaned forward and propped his elbows on his knees. "It would be helpful if you could tell us a little more about who you mean when you say lowlifes." "Why are you asking these questions if she died in a fire?" Maxted searched Carrigan's eyes, and then he understood. "This fire was intentional. Is that what you're saying?" "I wasn't saying anything, Mr. Maxted. But yes, we do believe the fire was intentional. We have no idea what Emily was doing at the convent or why anyone would want to set fire to it. And we were hoping to find out a little bit more about her." I don't understand. Lillian was sitting up. She had wiped her eyes dry of tears and makeup, and there was a seriousness and purpose to her expression that had not been there before. It was clear to see that, even though this was probably the worst news she had ever received, she was no stranger to suffering, and that sudden shocking awareness of how thin life really is. It can't be her. Don't you see, Miles? It can't be her. She began to laugh, her eyes crinkling with light. Thank God! She grabbed Carrigan's wrists, encircling them with her palms. I'm afraid that... But it can't be! Lillian stared at Carrigan, her eyes and face each telling a different story. She wouldn't have set foot in a convent. That's not Emily. You're mistaken. Carrigan was about to correct her when Miles interrupted.
Lillian is quite right. We didn't bring Emily up to believe in that nonsense, and for all her failings and faults, religion, I'm glad to say, was not one of them.
His face was calm and composed, as if he were working out a crossword rather than talking about his daughter's death. But when Carrigan glanced down, he could see the man's hand worrying the arm of the chair. The area under his fingers had scuffed and frayed over the years, and Miles kept picking at it, as if it were a scab too itchy to resist. That's what puzzles us, too, Carrigan began to say, then stopped, as he heard a door closing upstairs, followed by the sharp percussive patter of a pair of high heels against a wooden floor. He looked up, and he saw her, and he blinked. She was descending the staircase slowly, her eyes roaming the room below, alighting on the unexpected faces of the detectives and the muted expressions of her parents. She had sunset blonde hair, dark sparkly eyes, and a small nervous mouth. Her long flowing dress covered her feet and made it seem as if she were floating above the ground. She hesitated halfway down, then continued, each step taking a fraction longer than the one before, and it was clear from her expression that she knew there was nothing good waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. But Carrigan didn't notice any of this, because all he could think about was how much she looked like Emily Maxted. Chapter 20.
Donna, go upstairs now.
The snap of Miles Maxted's voice broke the spell. The woman stopped halfway down the stairs, torn between obeying her father and her curiosity regarding the two visitors. Carrigan could now see that her resemblance to Emily had been more a trick of the light than anything else.
Donna!
Miles Maxted's tone was sharp and firm, his eyes turning small. What's happening? Donna looked at her parents, at the detectives, at her parents again. Mum? Is everything all right? Lillian Maxted didn't reply. She was sitting slouched in her armchair, silent sobs racking her body, her fingers tangled around a loose knot of hair. Dad? What's going on? Carrigan looked over and saw that Miles was enjoying the confusion and surprise on his and Geneva's faces.
Detective Carrigan, this is my daughter Donna.
He pursed his lips and seemed to be studying them as he spoke.
Emily and Donna are twins, as you may have surmised.
Emily? Is Emily okay? Donna came to a stop next to Carrigan, and he could feel the heat of her body in the space between them. She looked up at him, and he saw the moment it clicked in her eyes, and it was an awful thing to witness. Please, someone tell me what's going on. She looked over at her mother, but Lillian Maxted's blank stare and slumped posture only confirmed Donna's worst fears. I'm afraid we found your sister's body at the site of a fire. Donna Maxted shook her head. She blinked, shook her head again, looked at her parents. Her skin was drawn tight over her cheekbones and seemed as fragile as the most delicate china. She walked over towards Lillian, her gait unsteady, catching her heels against each other, a stagger stumble that almost made her lose her balance. She took her mother's hands and held them as she searched Carrigan's face for an answer, or a joke, or a mistake. "What happened? How did she—" "That's what we're trying to find out," Carrigan replied. He knew that at this stage, distraction and facts were all that kept the bridge from collapsing. That was yet to come, when the family was alone, when the sirens and phone calls stopped, when they were left with only the night and the unassailable weight of memory and space. "We need to ask you a few questions, but it's okay if we do this later. I know this must be—" Donna met his eyes. "You said she was killed in a fire, but that doesn't explain why you're here." And then she stopped as it dawned on her. "You mean it wasn't an accident?" Carrigan nodded. "I can't imagine what's going through your head at this moment. I can't even begin to imagine. There's a family liaison officer who'll be here soon and help you with anything practical you need." "Do you know of anyone who may have had cause to harm Emily?" Geneva's voice was sharp and clipped, cutting Carrigan off. Donna shook her head, but Miles snorted, a harsh expulsion of air in the silent room. "Miles, really?" Lillian had recovered herself and shot her husband a look dense with broken promises and bedroom history.
"Oh, come on, Lillian. You've been living in this fantasy world, thinking that one day Emily will come to her senses, that she'll knock on the door and be the daughter we always wanted. But that was never going to happen, and Christ, now it never will."
Miles looked down at his feet.
"You asked me if anyone would harm her, Inspector. Well, I believe you've got your work cut out for you. The people she hung around with, the things she got up to. So many times I explained to her the damage she was doing to herself and to this family. But she just went harder and faster down the road she had chosen, and there was nothing I or her mother could do about it."
His fingers picked at the chair with increased vigour, his lips almost disappearing. Donna's phone started beeping. She ignored it, and eventually it stopped. "Have you any idea what Emily would have been doing in a convent?" Geneva asked. There was a look of confusion on Donna's face, quickly followed by a faint glimmer of something which almost resembled hope. "Emily in a convent? She hated religion, always did. Are you absolutely sure it was her?" "We have witnesses who saw her visiting the convent regularly over the last year." The phone started ringing again.
"For God's sake, turn that bloody thing off!"
Miles snarled at his daughter. "Actually, it's mine," Geneva said, getting up and answering it as she shuffled off to a corner of the room. "When did you last speak to your sister?" Carrigan could see Donna falling apart by the second, a drawing in of body and spirit that was painful to watch. When she answered, her voice was choked and stumbled, air and tears and the broken-off bits of words all mixing together. "Not for a long time. Maybe 18 months, maybe more." She stared down at her hands, and Carrigan knew what was going through her head at that very moment. How easy it was to pick up a phone, how hard to go back and make up for the things you never did. "Was there any particular reason that you or your parents hadn't spoken to her for so long?" Donna looked over at her father. He returned her stare, and though the meaning of his expression was hard to read, its tone left nothing to be deciphered. "We haven't spoken since Dad cut her out."
"Donna, that's enough."
Miles turned towards his one remaining daughter, his mouth small and pursed. "We're going to find out anyway, so it's best you tell us in your own words." Miles's top lip curled slightly as he appraised Carrigan.
"I cut her out of my will. Okay? Satisfied?"
"Can I ask why?" Miles's mouth got even tighter.
"No, you cannot. Some things are private."
"I'm aware of that. But the more information we have, even if seemingly irrelevant, the quicker we'll find out who did this to your daughter and punish them." Carrigan used the penultimate word carefully, watching the man's eyes flicker as he said it. "Absolutely not." Miles's nostrils flared, and he gripped the edges of his chair. "What I did or didn't do is none of your business, and if you have any more questions, I suggest you contact my solicitor."
Miles Maxted stared up at Carrigan, his eyes simmering and bright.
"I think it's time you left."
The maid appeared out of nowhere, silent and grey, and if she knew what had happened, then she didn't show it at all. She took them through the long corridor, and just as they were turning into the hallway, Carrigan heard loud, uncontrolled sobbing coming from the main room, and he was glad they were finally out of earshot. Donna met them in the foyer. She handed them their jackets and apologised for her parents. She managed to appear calm and lucid, and even a little charming. But as soon as she walked away, they both saw the grief and pain sag her body again as she headed back to the living room. They'd driven back in silence, not much left to say to each other. Carrigan had always felt like this after delivering a notification of death, slumped and slightly soiled, the herald of slammed doors, unspoken guilt and painful longing. He parked the car in his usual spot and was putting the keys back in his jacket pocket when he felt something rustling inside. He pulled out the wrinkled piece of paper, assuming it was a stray bit of litter, a chocolate wrapper he'd neglected to chuck, and was just about to bin it, when he noticed the handwriting. He unfolded it carefully and read what Donna had written. "We need to talk. Somewhere without my parents. There's a lot about Emily I couldn't tell you in front of them." And below that, she had written her phone number. Chapter 21. She held him by the throat and stared into his eyes as he strained and struggled and moaned. She wanted them, his eyes, to speak to her, to tell her all the things his mouth wouldn't, but they were impenetrable as stones. She grabbed his wrist and held it firmly, feeling the smooth skin on his forearm, the slight ripple of veins, the weight of it lying in her palm. Then she brought it up to her lips and kissed it softly, running her tongue across the scars on his skin, the shrapnel bites from some dusty, forgotten war, past the inoculations he'd received as a child, and then she fell onto him, her whole body forced into one deflation, spirit and muscle together, and the room melted away from her. The day, the week, the life, everything she thought about and didn't want to think about, everything that was keeping her awake at night, that was running through her brain like crazed viral screams, all of it forgotten and lost as she lowered her head and tasted his mouth. Blue Valentine was playing in the background. He'd brought the LP with him, knowing her copy would be lost somewhere among the boxes and bags, the unpacked strata of her life. She could barely hear the music and didn't want to. It brought back too many memories, good memories and bad ones, the whole arc of a love affair contained on two sides of spinning plastic. "What's wrong?" Lee said, twisting away, taking the duvet with him, reaching out and picking up one of her cigarettes from the table by the bed. He lit it and then passed it to her and lit another for himself. "Nothing's wrong." The words came out mixed with smoke and sting. She looked away, out the window, into the falling confusion of snow. "If you wanted someone to lie to, Geneva, you should have picked a stranger." She said nothing, dragging tight-lipped on her cigarette, and continued to watch the spiralling squalls of snow. All that freedom, each flake spinning and dancing in the air its own individual steps, but it didn't matter how well you danced, she knew. You'd always end up crashing to the floor in the end. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said, and was immediately aware of the weakness of that line, the way it had been said 1,000,000 times before, and wasn't that partly why she was so discontented? Her life as the other woman, turning her into a cliché with every passing day. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Lee said, sitting up, the duvet falling and revealing his chest, and she had to turn away again, because it was too much. It means exactly what it means. She stubbed the cigarette out in one hard stab and gasped as the cherry burnt her fingers. Geneva... He tried to take her hand, but she retracted it, sat up, pulled the sheets over her body and shook her head. It means I'm sick of waking up in the middle of the night and turning around and you're not there, slipped out like some thief or gigolo. It means I'm sick of closing my eyes and holding you and imagining your wife waiting up half the night, not sure where you are, suspecting, the baby crying for Daddy, and Daddy stumbling home at 4 a.m, reeking of sex and booze. That's not your concern, Jenny. That's mine. Of course it fucking is. What do you think I see when I look in the mirror? The person I wanted to be, or the person I am? This woman, breaking up another woman's life. And it's not just her. You have a son, Lee. You have a life that you can't just sunder any time you want. That's my choice, he said. And she was pleased to see a flash of anger roil through his body, the muscles tensing against the skin, making him look young and hungry again. And this is mine, she replied, staring at the rumpled duvet, the late falling snow, the unpacked boxes and ex-lover inhabiting her bed. And please... She took a swig of tequila and lit another cigarette, her head spinning in time with the music. Please don't tell me it's not working between the two of you. Don't tell me you're only staying with her because of the baby. Don't fucking tell me you were going to leave her anyway. I don't want to hear it, Lee. I don't want you to leave her for me. I don't want to start it all over again. We tried that, remember? We tried it once, and we both know what happened. All pretense at post-coital murmur and cuddle were gone. Lee sat up and swigged from the bottle. His eyes had grown small and cold. And what about you, Jenny? You were the one who texted me tonight. You're the one who keeps calling. Sometimes I think I'm no more than a convenient excuse for you to escape your life. And this time there was nothing she could say, because she knew he was right. You like this, he continued. You like the fact you can call me when you want or not call me when you don't. You like it that there's no commitment on your part. That's not fair. He slid over toward her and nodded. Sorry, perhaps it wasn't, but Jenny, you need to find something in your life to make you smile again. Christ, I remember what you were like once, before all this fucking work of yours dragged you down. You need to find something or someone that makes the rest of it worthwhile. You can't go around like this all the time. She sprang up from the bed, suddenly and uncontrollably furious. Because he was wrong, or because he was right? You expect me to smile and bounce and say, "Hi, how's your day?" after I've spent 12 hours looking at dead bodies? After I've talked to the worst scum this city has to offer and watched them walk away free to ruin more lives? Jesus Christ, Lee, you know what it's like. You weren't any different when you used to come back from those trips to Bosnia, Colombia, the Congo. That's exactly why I stopped, Geneva. That's why I don't do it anymore. You have to make your accommodations with the world at some point. You have to stop doing the things that tear you apart and settle for the ones that don't. Then why are you still here? Why are you even answering my calls? I didn't say it makes you happy, just less unhappy. She started putting on clothes, the scatter of shirts and socks under her feet. I don't know what you expect me to do. The fucking day I had. We all have days. But did yours involve spending hours looking at photographs of corpses burnt to a crisp? Tell me. Using a magnifying glass to stare and stare at scratch marks on dead women's shin bones? That's what I've been doing. You really think... What? She saw his face turn white as the sheets, his mouth hanging half open. What did I say? What kind of marks? Lee asked in a whisper. Shallow vertical cuts along the shin bone. Lee sighed deeply and shook his head, as if trying to shrug off a bad dream.
tickling the bone," he said. And he said it so softly that Geneva had to ask him to repeat it. What the fuck is tickling the bone? She tried to make light of it, but saw something in his expression that stopped her dead. It's a very painful method of extracting information or of just plain hurting someone. The torturer makes a small incision in the skin just above the shin bone. He then takes an ice pick or something similar and gently presses it into the wound until it comes into contact with the bone. Normally, this is when he will look up and ask the first question. Then, slowly, he rakes the tip of the ice pick against the bone, scraping and chipping away, causing excruciating pain. Geneva wrapped the duvet around her, but it didn't stop her shakes. "You know this?" Lee nodded gravely. "When I was doing my pieces on Mexico, I came up against this a lot. Tickling the bone was originally a speciality of South American dictatorships. These days it's used mainly by the drug cartels."
Chapter 22.
The book was waiting for him, as he'd known it would be. He saw the padded envelope and recognised it for what it was immediately. There'd be no return address, he knew, no fingerprints, and the postmark would be different from the previous time. Each month, for the last year, he'd been receiving a book in the post. There was just the book and the envelope, his name and address typed out and pasted to the front. There was no note inside, and the books were new, unhandled, even though some, Carrigan had checked, had been out of print for years. The first book had arrived just before last Christmas, and he'd thought it had been misdelivered, even after reading his own name off the front of the envelope. Because who would be sending him books anonymously? That first offering had been Plotinus the Enneads, and he'd pored over the text looking for some indication of who its sender may have been, but there were only the words, etched out almost 2,000 years ago. He took the envelope out of the box, along with a handful of bills and a flyer for a canine cancer charity. He ripped open the envelope, unable to wait until he got inside, and pulled out a dark-jacketed paperback, God in Search of Man, by Abraham Heschel. He'd never heard of it, and it seemed forbidding, its opaque cover and even more opaque language. He flicked through it briefly, then put it under his arm and entered the flat. He'd left the lights on again. The Bills would remember that. He'd left the window slightly open, and blowing snow had frosted the ledge and buckled a series of newspapers he'd saved, meaning to read them when he finally had some time to himself. But they were now useless, the words melting into each other, the ink running and mixing, the pictures all but unrecognisable. There were no messages on his answering machine, no voices to greet him. He spent a few minutes telling Louise about his day, then took the burrito out of his bag and stripped it of packaging and placed it in the microwave. The beep reminded him it was there. He ate facing the window and was finished before he'd even begun to taste it. Everyone kept telling him he'd reached an age where he needed to watch what he ate and how much, but these little treats were often the only moments of calm and pleasure in his day. He turned on the TV, but he couldn't concentrate, his head unable to stop spinning, running the latest facts and finds through each scenario and possibility. Something about Emily's arrest sheet didn't make sense. It was a feeling. More than a feeling. A small black stone lodged in his brain. There had been so much new information today that he was finding it hard to keep track, but that was good. The initial log jam had been sundered, and now they were awash in a cascade of data, the kind every investigation needs to propel itself in the early days. He knew most of the leads would go nowhere. He knew that any life would open up to mystery and confusion if you looked at it hard enough, but he also knew that there was something he'd missed. He cleared the dishes, and then the night was all there was, and he sat staring at the motorway ramp outside his window, jewelled with the lights of passing cars,
a steady exodus from the choke and cram of the capital. After the third ginger beer, he picked up the phone and called her. "Wanted to say thanks for the coffee." "Oh, it's you," she said, her voice slightly slurred, and he felt suddenly guilty, knowing she worked shifts and wondering if he'd awoken her from a long-cherished sleep. "I hope I didn't disturb you." She laughed, a carefree chuckle that crackled through the receiver. "I just got in," she said. "Back on at 2 tomorrow, but I can't sleep." "Me neither," he said. "Lucky we have the phone." They talked about things that were part of their daily lives, about time and space and the pressures of shift work, and as he heard her soft, exotic voice, he felt better, calmer, and less hassled. And he flicked idly through the files on his desk, Emily's record, and listened to Karen telling him stories from the 3 in the morning A&E wards, sad tales of late-night mistakes and stumbles, and even sadder, those who had nothing wrong with them and had just come in for some company to get them through the night. She told him about her sister who had died and how it had changed her, not in one big explosion, but in a million small yet significant ways, and of the men she'd been with, both kind and cruel, and countries she'd visited, and the ones she still wanted to. And he imagined her standing in some lost-forgotten desert out on the edge of the world, amidst the dust and heat, her black hair crackling in the wind. And then he stopped. Karen's voice faded to a whisper as he stared at the page in front of him. He looked at the mugshot photo, seeing the pain and long nights of battle in Emily's eyes, and then he knew what had been bothering him about the arrest sheet and cursed himself for not having seen it earlier. "I've got to go, I'm sorry," he said, and she said she was tired too, and the night was getting shorter, and that they would talk again, and he listened to the dead hum of the phone after they'd said goodbye, and he listened to it for several seconds. And then he got up, cleared the table of junk and paper, and spread out Emily's arrest sheets and warrants across the scratched plastic surface. Emily had been arrested in March 2008 outside Whitehall. She'd been smoking a joint when a uniformed officer walked past. He arrested her and took her to the nearest station. Carrigan stared at the page, puzzled. Cannabis was a low priority for the Met, and a huge waste of resources. 4 hours of processing paperwork and a beat constable off the streets for half his shift over a single joint, which was why, in most cases, a caution was often enough. But there was something about the date of the arrest that was vaguely familiar. He noted the day, time, and exact location, then picked up the phone. The desk sergeant sounded tired and pissed off, and reluctant to do anything that meant moving from his chair. He eventually grunted an acknowledgement and wrote down the date and postcode Carrigan had recited. Jack could hear the man slowly punching in letters and numbers on the other end of the phone. He stared out at the cars gliding through the night, and then the sergeant was back on the line. Carrigan had asked him to perform a search for all arrests on the same day as Emily's and within a half-mile radius of her location. "How many?" He leaned into the phone as if that would make the answer more understandable. 456. 456 arrests on that day? Yes. The sergeant paused as he scrolled through the list. Pretty much all of them for public nuisance or disorder breaches. Carrigan thanked him and put the phone down. 455 other people had been arrested on the same day and in close vicinity to Emily. He opened a new window, typed in the arrest date and location into Google, and watched as a list of web pages and news articles appeared. The websites all belonged to student and anarchist groups. The news articles made him remember why the date had seemed so familiar. An anti-war march had been held that day, which had left many police injured and half the shops on Oxford Street destroyed. Pacifists fighting against war. Carrigan had been there that day, along with every other policeman who wasn't on leave and most of those who were. The march was supposed to be peaceful, and yet, within a couple of hours, it had turned into a battlefield. The police were attacked from all sides, objects and projectiles raining down, fists and legs and angry, scowling students in black balaclavas wielding metal poles and Molotov cocktails. He stared at the screen, remembering the chaos and fear. Amidst all the lawlessness and looting, why had Emily been arrested for smoking a single joint? He made another coffee and paced the flat. Sometimes it was easier to arrest someone for drugs than public disorder, he reasoned. The weed would put her in a cell while they checked the CCTV to see if a further charge was warranted. It made sense, and yet it didn't make any sense. He walked over to the chair and picked up his jacket. He went through the pockets, getting rid of the amassed junk and twists of chocolate wrappers, and then he found the card. He stared at the words Donna had written. "There's a lot about Emily I couldn't tell you in front of them," and picked up the phone. He spent the next hour going through his policy book, making sure there were no avenues left unexplored, no time bombs ticking in anomalous timelines or misrecounted fact. He popped 2 pills for the headache erupting from his left temple. He went back to Geneva's notes and read through them again, her account of the nuns busting up a drug-dealing operation in their backyard, the picketing and leafleting, and he turned on the computer and waited for the PNC screen to boot up. A couple of years back, he'd got Berman to fix access to the PNC through his home computer, and he now logged on. As he waited for the system to recognise him, he opened a packet of German biscuits, half moons dusted with crushed hazelnuts and powdered sugar. He took out exactly half the biscuits and put them on a plate. The rest he bagged and returned to the kitchen. This was how you went about a diet, in small and manageable steps, in learning to resist easy temptation. He ate the biscuits and began searching. He analysed patterns of recent drug activity in West London, the ever-shifting flowchart of alliances and feuds. He drank black coffee and trawled through out-of-date arrest sheets and old serials, looking for something, he wasn't quite sure what. He finished the biscuits and got up and fetched the rest from the kitchen. He read reports of petty turf wars, stabbings or beatings over nondescript street corners in Kensington or Kilburn or Kensal Rise. Market forces and the myth of a recession-proof business. New groups coming from every part of the world to contest such rich territory. The inexorable globalization of criminal enterprise. He finished the last biscuit and started going through 12 months' worth of drug squad reports. He was focusing on St. Peter's Square and the neighbouring streets when he found mention of an altercation the uniforms had been called to a couple of weeks earlier. A group of concerned residents in a residential street off Pembridge Square decided they'd had enough of dealers doing business in their front gardens. They organised themselves and made a nuisance whenever anyone came down the road looking to make a buy. They found out the address of the local dealer and plastered posters outside his house and all across the street, naming and shaming him in photographs and deeds. They assiduously reported all offences and suspicions to the local station. A week later, the uniforms were called to the scene of 2 residents lying beaten, bloody and battered on the pavement. The assailants were nowhere to be seen, and the victims had been too stunned and shocked and scared to say who did this to them. Carrigan sat back and rolled his shoulders, waiting for the welcoming pop that would untangle his muscles. There was no mention of nuns in the report, but the residents' actions were very similar to the nuns' initiatives in combating drug dealing in the neighbourhood. Carrigan looked up from the screen into the starless sky. Could it be that they'd got it all wrong? That Emily and the nuns' tangled history in Peru had nothing to do with the fire? That it all came down to something as stupid and pointless as this? He turned off the computer and stood by the window. He didn't want to think about it, but it was all he could think about. He knew sleep would not find him tonight, and he didn't bother looking for it. The snow was falling in thick, spinning clusters, obscuring the motorway ramp and street outside. Somewhere above, he could see the faint blips of light, marking another plane leaving the city and disappearing into the sky, a tiny metallic cylinder crammed with people and hopes and histories on the way to somewhere else. Chapter 23. The incident room was empty at this time of the morning, and that was exactly the way she liked it. The antiseptic white spaces were silent but for the buzz and murmur of computers left on overnight, hard drives wheezing like exhausted workers at the end of a long and gruelling shift. Geneva could hear the splash and fizz of the Coke in her can, the steady pulse of the fluorescence above her, and popped 2 more pills, trying desperately to focus. She'd had way too much tequila last night, and she had woken alone at 4 a.m. with a blazing headache. She didn't want to think about the flung words and accusations between her and Lee last night, but she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd told her after she had mentioned the pathologist's findings. She fought back a wave of nausea, spread out her notes either side of the keyboard, checked her to-do list, and sent out a request to Westminster and to Kensington and Chelsea for parking tickets registered to the fake SUV number plate. The chances were almost 0. The men in the SUV probably changing plates with great frequency, but nonetheless it annoyed her that no one else had bothered to check this. Once this was done, she opened the box sitting at her feet. The diocese had sent further files on the convent yesterday, and she went through these now, reading about their charity endeavours, anti-drug initiatives, and numerous commendations. She flicked through the files until she saw a folder for travel requests. She took out the crumpled photocopies within and scanned them. For each trip out of the country, the nuns had to fill out a form requesting leave. 1 copy was sent to the diocese and another to the order for approval. There were nearly 50 such forms, and Geneva went through them slowly, making notes of which countries the nuns had visited. 23 requests had been made for travel to the Vatican, 12 to the Holy Land, and 3 to Ireland. The remaining 8 requests were for travel to Peru. Geneva pulled out the earliest request and scrutinised the handwriting. The form was a request from Sister Glenda Waldron for a 6-day leave to go to Lima during the last week of September 2011. The reason for the trip was given as conference. There was an identical form for Sister Rose McGregor. She remembered the name from the files at the diocese. Sister Rose had been the last nun to leave the convent almost a year ago. The requisition forms had 2 signature boxes at the bottom, one for departure and one for arrival. Sister Glenda's signature filled both boxes, but Sister Rose had only signed the departure box. Geneva briefly wondered if Sister Rose had forgotten to fill in the form on her arrival, but the records were too well kept and organised for this to be likely. She read through the other 6 travel requests. Each was signed, arrival and departure, by Sister Glenda. She went back to the main set of files, but there was no record of Sister Rose anywhere. Geneva pushed her chair back and rubbed her eyes. 2 of the nuns had travelled to Peru in the last 18 months, one of them on 7 separate occasions. She felt a tingle in her stomach. She knew this changed everything. The Peruvian connection was no longer just ancient history. She jotted down the dates and made a note to call Holden. Then, thinking back to last night, the look in Lee's eyes, the way the words seemed so reluctant to leave his mouth, she entered Tickling the Bone into the search engine. There were many references to comedians and funny bones, but hidden among the humour and jape was an article about how drug cartels were getting more sophisticated and grimly medieval by the day. How the violence and torture had left the private sphere and was now occurring in the world mesh of YouTube and Flickr. The article described this particular method of torture exactly as Lee had. The use of an ice pick, the breaking of the skin, the point of the pick inserted through the tender flesh until it came up against the bone. She read reports from undercover DEA agents who had undergone this ordeal. She thought about the nuns' trips to Peru, her heart beating a little faster. There was a sidebar detailing history and uses. Tickling the bone had been the favoured method of torture used by right-wing paramilitaries against leftist agitators or folk singers or writers or people who had been mistaken for someone else. This technique, the report stated, was primarily used in Central America, in El Salvador and Nicaragua. But it had also been adopted by Pinochet's men in Chile and had spread to Colombia, Peru and Ecuador. She clicked on the word Peru, her breath held and body tensed, and read tales of military coups and counter-coups, repression and poverty, oil and torture, and bicycle bombs in the marketplace. The phrase liberation theology kept cropping up between the margins and across the texts. There was a whole section about armed insurgents in the Inca Hills, a band of Maoist guerrillas called the Shining Path, led by an ex-professor of philosophy, cutting a swathe through the Andean heartlands, burning the bourgeois blight from the ground as if it were weeds, and enmeshing the country in a 20-year civil war. She sat back, the lights washing over her as she thought about what she had learned in the diocese archives and what she'd just read. 7 of the nuns had been stationed in South America. Their stay had only overlapped for 4 months during the autumn of 1973 in the San Gabriel province in the south-central section of the country. All 7 of them had been relocated shortly afterwards. 5 of the nuns had identical torture scars. The pathologist had estimated the scars to be 30 or 40 years old. Geneva looked at the flickering screen, willing to bet her salary, her iPod, whatever she owned, that the scars dated from the autumn of 1973. Something had happened in those cold mountains up near the roof of the world, something which had followed the nuns all the way to London in the 21st century. She felt a surge in her chest as she punched in the nuns' names, dates of deployment, and locations in varying sequences. She came up with nothing, or with so many results it amounted to the same thing. She stopped, thought about it, and recalibrated her search parameters, this time substituting the word political for religious. There were 17 major political incidents in Peru during the time frame she was looking at, but only 1 in the remote San Gabriel region. She clicked on the link and was taken to a page devoted to analysing the dialectics of the September 73 strike at the Chiapeltec mine. She cross-checked the dates, feeling more and more certain, and began reading. The Chiapeltec gold mine had been worked continually since the days of the Incas. The Spanish had stumbled upon its natural bounty and duly co-opted it for the crown, using native Indian slaves to harvest the shiny flecks of metal embedded in the rocks. The mine had been in operation since then, closing down only intermittently, changing hands and countries of ownership with striking regularity, bought and resold and bought again. In 1973, the mine was in full production, the latest drilling and scouting technology applied to go even further down into the folds of compacted earth, searching for the elusive dust. The death rate for miners was the highest in South America at the time, comparable to the mortality rate for slaves during the Spanish occupation. Geneva read dour reports of silicosis, cave-ins, noxious fumes, bar fights, and strange cancers. By the sizzling, scorched summer of 1973, things had come to a head. 12 miners and 2 priests from the local village who'd tried to organise a strike disappeared. They were found 3 days later hanging upside down, naked and mutilated in the village square. Geneva glanced out the window, measuring the spindrift and gather of snow on the sill, trying to clear her head of the dread images the words had conjured. The phones kept ringing on the empty tables, and she stared at them until the answering machines kicked in. Her private mobile hadn't stopped buzzing all morning, and she checked the display. But it wasn't Lee, and, despite herself, she felt a little sink of disappointment. Oliver had rung 5 times in the last hour and left 3 messages. She switched off the phone and continued reading. The news of the murders had quickly spread from village to village, mine to mine, up mountains and down the long ancient river. And soon strangers started turning up at Chiapeltec, bearded burly men with serious brows wrinkled in righteousness and rage, priests and nuns and ordinary people. Journalists made the trek up to the high country with their cameras and microphones, their big city certainties and beliefs safely in pocket. The village swelled and roared during the night with the megaphone voices of political agitators, Marxists and Castroists, anarchists and liberation theologians, the crazed and God-touched. A committee was formed by a leading Peruvian bishop, and a strike was called for the following day. There was a party atmosphere that night, a feeling of comradeship and unity, of purpose and prophecy, a swelling together of farmers and miners, intellectuals and holy men. The first day of the strike went by peacefully. The workers lined up either side of the only paved road in the province, the atmosphere one of genial protest rather than anger or violence. Everyone went back to the village that night and celebrated their success with loud music and laughter, so that no one heard the bomb go off. There was a house at the far edge of the mine company's property that the owners and management used for lunch and to conduct meetings. It was only in use during business hours. The bomb had been set to explode at midnight. It destroyed the building, leaving only grey ash and fingers of smoke curling up into the dark sky. It also destroyed the lives of 12 women and 34 children who had been secretly relocated there in case their homes were targeted during the strike. No one knew who'd set the bomb, and squabbling and blame broke out among the strikers the next day, all of them knowing that the stakes had changed overnight. The bosses buried their wives and children that morning, and then they called in the army. But the army was busy killing leftists in the dappled Inca hills. The government sent the next best thing, a battalion of death squad veterans. They came with blowtorches and machine guns, machetes and cattle prods, grudges and century-old hatreds boiling in their blood. But the villagers had their own weapons, clubs and pitchforks and hammers and anything they could find lying about in the sheds or stony fields. The battle raged across the day and deep into the night. The army was sent in on the second day, and 200 strikers disappeared and were never seen again. The mine owners shipped in workers from the mountains, tough, gnarled Indians who didn't care about conditions and safety as long as they got paid. The murdered strikers' families were booted out of their homes and the village that very night. Geneva squinted as she finished the article and skimmed the footnotes, the long lists of the disappeared, the rumours of swirling, moaning pits out in the hills, the flowcharts of red terrorists and religious institutions. The government blamed the insurgency on Marxist agitators, calling the bomb a terrorist outrage, the president appearing on national TV and saying that when the body had a sore, you had to cut it out quickly or it would spread to the rest of the body. She sat back, queasy and shaken, the story reeling through her blood. She made notes and opened another can of Coke, then logged into the Press Association website with the password she had got from Lee last night. She searched for images from the Chiapeltec massacre. To her surprise, there were many, taken by brave and foolish photographers, and you could tell it hadn't been an easy assignment. The shots often blurred and out of focus, a jostled sense of panic in each frame, a feeling that this was something photography couldn't capture, that was too quick and mercurial and real. There were photos of picket lines, army gun boots, vapour trails, grinning soldiers, and one of a woman holding her screaming baby as she lay sprawled and dead on the railroad track. There were hundreds of these photos, and Geneva scanned through them quickly, her hangover coming back hard and strong, the blood and screaming faces making her feel as if she could taste her own stomach. And then she stopped and zoomed and clicked on a thumbnail of a photo near the bottom of the page. She tapped her foot as the full-size file slowly unscrolled on her screen. The image was of a bristling picket line, all grimaces and clenched fists, maybe 20 or 30 people standing out in the bright, dusty sun, arms raised heavenwards, or holding handmade banners with skulls and demons crudely daubed upon them. And it wasn't until Geneva zoomed in closer and studied the faces one by one that she recognised her. She was much younger, of course, but there was no doubt it was the same woman. Mother Angelica stood left of centre, wearing the full habit, wimple and cincture, and those tight round glasses that had led to her being nicknamed the Owl. Her mouth was twisted in a snarl of indignation, and she had one arm raised, her fist pumping the empty sky. Geneva looked at Mother Angelica for a long moment, then studied the faces of the people standing beside her, time and the piled emotions of the occasion making everything seem both dreamlike and utterly vivid at the same time. Behind the nuns was a group of priests. One of them was a full head taller than the others, and in his fist he held a large wooden club studded with nails. Even across 40 years, Geneva recognised the penetrating stare of Father Callum McCarthy. Chapter 24. Berwick Street in the Snow. The fruit sellers crying out their bargains, the dazed Japanese tourists with record bags held protectively to their chests, the rainbow-haired girls from St. Martin's buying cloth for their end-of-year shows. A little further down, the pawn parlours and DVD shops, lingerie emporiums and spangly nightclubs. Vegetables and lunch-hour sex side by side. Carrigan trudged through the slush, past the doorways with their peeling paint and crude handwritten cards promising pleasure, up 2 sets of stairs, and the frazzle-eyed hipsters heading home for the night. As a teenager, he'd come here often to buy records, blithely unaware of this shadow world existing alongside. A sad reproduction of Amsterdam for people who'd never seen Amsterdam. The buildings, faded and dilapidated, the girls crying out from blue velvet booths, their voices shrill and indifferent, as if calling out items at a supermarket till. After what he'd read last night, an idea had begun forming. He thought about the dealers in the alleyway behind the convent, the SUV visits, the men who'd attacked him in the ruins. He needed to know who was running drugs in his patch, who the nuns might have upset, and what kind of people they were dealing with. So, last night, he'd sent out a Met-wide request for information on drug activity in West London. A couple of hours later, he'd received a call from D.S. Bird, who worked for the Met's organised crime unit, suggesting they meet at the White Dove. The pub could have been a museum piece, a smoked antique seeped in beer fumes and muzzy light, a last remaining bastion of the old Soho, before the scenesters and media companies had taken over. You could still smell the smoke, though it had been years since the last cigarette had been crushed out in the last ashtray. The windows were almost opaque, and the world outside reduced to a blur of smudges and passing shadows, disappearing as quickly as dreams. Carrigan scanned the bar for Bird, but saw only old men hunched over pints of beer, their eyes already foggy and surrendered by lunchtime. You could read their life stories in the way they sat and stared at their drinks. It was the kind of place only the terminally lost frequented, and the state of the decor and furnishings was testament to the fact that all anyone cared about was the level of liquid in their glass and the 3 feet of space which separated them from the rest of the world. Carrigan finally spotted D.S. Bird sitting at a corner table, a pint of murky ale and 2 clear shot glasses lined up in front of him. Bird was in his late 50s, but he was the youngest person here.
Thanks for meeting me.
Was having my lunch anyway.
Bird shrugged by way of reply. His face was long and thin, riddled with folds, his hair a lanky black shawl draped across his eyes. His left leg was constantly in motion, pumping up and down against the floor, his eyes scanning the room.
You're on the convent fire, right?
Bird reached for his pint and took a long, deep swallow, then picked up one of the shot glasses and downed it in one. Carrigan nodded.
And what does any of that have to do with drugs?
The nuns were active in anti-drug initiatives, Carrigan explained. They had quite a presence in the neighbourhood. They shooed off some dealers from an alley at the back of the convent. There's also reports of them picketing dealers' houses, approaching incoming customers with leaflets on rehab centres and the curative powers of God. Bird listened intently, his eyes unblinking. He took in Carrigan's words without expression, then had another sip of beer, followed by the second shot. Carrigan opened his briefcase and pulled out a file. From inside he took out a photo of the man with the scarred mouth that Berman had printed off from the CCTV footage. Bird looked at the photo and his eyes narrowed. He didn't say anything. This man visited the convent at least 3 times before the fire. He was standing outside watching the convent burn down that night. He also assaulted me in the ruins the next day. He saw the merest flicker of interest in Bird's eyes, but the sergeant managed to snuff it out almost immediately.
Where did you get this?
CCTV camera outside the school next door to the convent. Who is he? Bird stared into his glass in silent deliberation.
We know him only as Victor. He's a lieutenant for one of the top Albanian bosses, Dimitar Duka.
Duka, Carrigan repeated, his teeth buzzing.
Runs one of the larger Albanian gangs. Victor's his right-hand man. If he's involved, then it's something that's important to Duka.
Albanians, Carrigan said. You mean the Albanian mob? Bird nodded, got up and walked over to the bar, ordering another round of drinks. His legs wobbled slightly as he came back across the room. He sat down, took a sip of beer and swiped back a shot. His eyes glassed over, and for a brief moment all the lines and long, hard years were temporarily erased. What the hell are the Albanians doing here? I didn't even know they were active in London.
War,
Bird replied, a grim smile on his face, and when he saw Carrigan's confused expression, he said,
Do you believe in the law of unintended consequences?
Carrigan looked at his drink, but he didn't need to think about it. We can never know the outcome of any given action.
Good. Too many people think they can see the future, and no one can. Bill Clinton passed sanctions on Serbia during the Bosnian War. The traditional route for heroin smuggling into Europe had always been from Turkey via Belgrade. The war closed that route. Albanian gangs suddenly found themselves literally in the right place at the right time. They could guarantee safe transit through the war zone. They made a lot of money, but, more importantly, they made a lot of connections. When the conflict was over, they entered the EU as asylum seekers and put together the infrastructure we see today. Initially, it was heroin they were involved in, but they were also behind the Securitas heist in 2006, several other armed robberies, and 1 million petty thieveries.
Carrigan could only shake his head. Even 20 years as a policeman hadn't exposed him to the full horror running through London's veins. It was like the fabled onion. Peel off one layer, and there was always something worse underneath. He looked at the old men leaning against the bar and wondered whether they realised what brave new times they'd survived into. Or maybe that was exactly why they were here, folded into bar stools and inner darkness, enacting a slow, stunned withdrawal from the world. Impressive, he admitted. How did they manage that? The Russian and Chechen gangs are no pushover.
Violence,
Bird answered flatly.
It's always going to be the primary currency in these cultures, and the Albanians have plenty to spare. Remember, We're talking about men who come from the bloodstorms of ethnic war, from mountain villages where grudge feuds have been playing out for centuries. A lot of them are ex-Sigurimi, the Albanian communist secret police. Our homegrown gangs were no match for them, and neither, as it turned out, were the Russians.
Bird stared at his empty glass.
You're lucky, Carrigan. With murders, you either solve them or you don't. In this job, you have to spend a year, maybe more, watching these scumbags enjoying their earnings, parading it in front of you. And most times, when you finally nab them and it goes to court, the witnesses recant or disappear, and they're back out on the streets the same fucking day.
Carrigan took a deep breath and sipped his coffee. You ever think about transferring? Bird smiled, but there was nothing remotely mirthful in his expression. He pulled a wallet out of his pocket and flipped it open to reveal 2 faded photos. One was of a normal suburban house, the other of a young woman holding a little boy.
That was my house, Bird said. That was my wife. She took all my money and the house. That's my son. I haven't spoken to him in over 4 years. I wouldn't even recognise him if he walked past me on the street.
He flipped the wallet shut and put it back in his jacket.
They remind me what I've already given up for this job. If I back out now, this would have been all for nothing,
he said. And it was obvious that he carried his bitterness like an enormous weight, that he had been both shrivelled and honed by it, and that it was the only thing still keeping him going. Carrigan drained his drink. The taste in his mouth was rank and metallic. This man, Duca, what can you tell me about him?
Duca runs most of the heavy drugs, coke, heroin, crack, through West London,
Bird replied.
The majority of the organised dealing in W2 has his involvement somewhere down the line. He keeps himself and his top people away from most of the dirty work, of course.
What about the area surrounding the convent? Anything there?
There's 4 houses in the postcode you mentioned we're keeping an eye on. Duca owns them, but they're not rented and he doesn't live there. We think he uses them as stash houses. The primary shipment gets cut and bagged there, then the mid-level dealers come and pick up their supplies. But Duca's smart. We think he's revolving the 4 houses randomly. Makes it almost impossible to get enough intel for a warrant.
Carrigan wondered if any of the houses the nuns had picketed belonged to Duca. Where are they, these 4 houses?
One's on Gloucester Terrace, one on Prince's Square, one on Queensborough Terrace, and one on Hatherley Crescent.
If a group of nuns hassled his dealers and pestered customers, how would Duca react? Would he go as far as burning down the convent?
He wouldn't think twice about it, Bird replied. But for something like that, I don't know. He'd just move his dealers to the next road along. He's not stupid. Wouldn't be where he is if he were. The nuns would have had to piss him off a little more than that before he took such a step.
Carrigan thought about this. Where did he come from? I've not heard his name come up before.
And that's because he's extremely good at what he does.
Bird ran long, skinny fingers through his greasy hair and drained his beer.
Duca was an elite member of a paramilitary group during the Kosovo conflict. He came here after the fighting was over and brought along a handful of his loyal troops. He made deals where he could and got rid of the competition where he couldn't.
That sounds to me like your average dirtbag dealer, Carrigan said, the pages in his notebook filling up fast, his handwriting deteriorating as he tried to catch up with the flow of names and facts pouring from Bird's lips. Bird's sudden laugh surprised him at the same time as making him feel distinctly uneasy.
Oh, he's a lot more than that.
Bird stared morosely at his empty glass.
Let me give you just one example. There's a story we heard from our informants. Duca had a younger brother, a bit slow by all accounts, and he used to take care of him, you know, like Hitler was good to his dogs and all that. Anyway, one day, Duca finds out that his bitter rival, the head of a neighbouring gang, has made plans to kidnap the brother and use him as a bargaining tool. Duca invites his rival to dinner so they can talk it over. The rival is intrigued, thinks he sees a chink of weakness in Duca's armour, so he accepts the offer. They drink good wine inside Duca's house and eat the most delicious stew the rivals ever tasted. They talk of the weather and the fields and the old men who never came back from the war. Finally, Duca leans over the table and gets to the point of the meeting. "You were looking for my brother, I hear." The rival stares into Duca's eyes, but he doesn't deny it. "Well," Duca says, taking the lid off the pot from which they've been eating, "I sincerely hope he was to your liking."
Bird leaned back and unleashed a blustery, bellowing laugh, and Carrigan briefly wondered if he had once been an eager young policeman assured in his mission, because all he saw now was a broken figure, plagued by failure and doubt, by the things he'd seen and the things he'd done, but most of all, plagued by the darkness residing within human hearts. "Where can I find Duca?" Bird shot his hand across the table and grabbed Carrigan's wrist. Despite the alcohol, his eyes were clear and focused as he spoke. "Keep away from him, Carrigan. You don't want to get involved. He's something new, something we haven't seen before. For some people, cruelty and revenge are arts to be practiced and endlessly improved upon. There are no rules here. It'll come straight for you." "That's exactly what I intend." Bird smiled.
"And none of what I've just told you puts you off?"
Carrigan extricated his arm from Bird's grip. "No," he replied. "It just makes me more certain that I need to speak to him. He sounds like exactly the kind of person who would have no qualms about killing 10 nuns." Bird's jaw tightened.
"The last thing you want is to be on Duca's radar, believe me. You've got to think about that, and you need to run anything through me first before you authorize any actions, understand? We're in the middle of several long-range operations, and I don't want you or your team stumbling into something you have no clue about."
Carrigan got up from the table. "Well, how about you tell me what your operations are, and then there'll be no chance of that happening?" Bird smiled, but it was one of the most malevolent things Carrigan had ever seen.
"Can't do that, and you know it. We need to protect our assets. Just make sure you check with us first. Wouldn't want you wading into deep water without knowing. You'll drown."
As Carrigan stepped back out into the spray of wind and snow, the world seemed dimmer and darker and more hopeless than before. He stood and thought about Bird's final remark, unsure whether it was meant as a friendly warning or a threat. Chapter 25. Sometimes you get lucky in the strangest of places, Geneva thought, as she scanned through the attachment Westminster Parking had sent her. She printed it out, laid the page across her table, and went down the columns just to make sure. Earlier, she'd sent out a request to Westminster and to Kensington and Chelsea Parking for any tickets issued to the black SUV in the last couple of months. She had thought it was a long shot, something that only had to be done because it had to be done, and was surprised when she got the results. The fake number plate belonging to the black SUV had picked up 4 parking tickets in the last 8 weeks. Each had been settled promptly within 7 days. One of the tickets was given on Queensway, outside a Chinese restaurant that Carrigan had once taken her to. The other 3 tickets were all issued on the same street, a small cul-de-sac off Westbourne Grove called Hatherley Crescent. Her skin began to itch as she magnified the tickets on her screen and tried to untangle the spidery handwriting. She looked across the incident room. D.C. Singh was on the phone, Berman and Jennings leaning intently over a computer screen. She looked at the parking tickets again. She didn't really trust it, this hunch of hers. It wasn't even that, just something which needed to be checked and crossed off the list, and she felt uneasy about taking anyone else away from their tasks on what would probably be a huge waste of time. Besides, she was only going to look at a section of road, nothing more. She thought about calling her mum as she walked down Bishopsbridge Road in the swirling snow and wind. She wanted to talk to her about what was going on in her life, Oliver, the job, but all she ever got was disapproval and distance. She lit a cigarette instead. She hadn't seen her mother for a while, several weeks. She kept telling herself it was the demands of the job, the long hours and crashing come-downs, but she knew it wasn't really that. It was her mother's new boyfriend, Greg, a lecturer in politics at the LSE, who nursed a pathological hatred for the police and goaded her at every opportunity, turning every meal into a minefield. It was the distance that had gradually grown between them since she'd joined the police force, her mother never quite forgiving her. But what Katrina didn't understand was that Geneva loved the puzzle of her days, sifting through the lies people told to others and those they told to themselves. There was an intoxication in the mystery of other people's lives, and it was hard to think of another career, another life. She dropped the cigarette in the snow and watched it disappear down a hole of its own making. She ignored the bag-laden tourists and grinning revellers surrounding her and turned into Hatherley Crescent. It was a short, narrow cul-de-sac with terraced Edwardian houses on one side and a 1930s mansion block on the other. The street was dark and cold and gloomy, the buildings forming a narrow canyon. She checked her notebook, shielding the pages from the snow. All 3 parking tickets had been given outside numbers 46 to 50 Hatherley Crescent. Geneva slowly made her way up the street until she was looking across at the space where the tickets were issued. It was a residence parking bay, and, of course, if you had a fake number plate, you couldn't have a residence permit, hence the tickets. Whatever business the driver of the SUV was on, it was obviously worth the £80 fine each time. She looked across the street at the doors of the 2 houses directly behind the parking bay, wondering which one the man with the scar had been visiting. Perhaps neither. Maybe this was just where he'd found an empty space to park, as he'd gone to pick up a takeaway from one of the many restaurants on Westbourne Grove. She shook the thought free and began crossing the road. She'd set her phone to silent, and the sudden vibration against her skin made her jump. She stopped and pulled it out and read the message. She read it twice, frantically wiping snow off the display, then read it once more. She realised she was clutching the phone so tightly it was beginning to hurt. The message was from Lee. She read it again, bringing the screen closer to her face. "You're right. We need to stop doing this. I'm sorry too." Her hands shook. Her stomach flipped. The words didn't make sense, and then they did. She read the message again. It said the same thing. She put the phone back in her pocket and crossed the street. Both houses were similarly weathered and in need of repair, both chipped and cracked and neglected, but the house on the left had 3 shiny new security cameras pointing at its front door. She took careful steps through the deep drifts of snow. The door was painted brown, and the paint had faded and flaked, but the locks were sturdy and recent. There was only one buzzer. Unlike most of the other buildings in the street, this one hadn't been cut up and converted into flats. The stone lion at the head of the stairs was missing half its face, but the burglar alarm and security system were new and high-end. She rang the doorbell, first hesitatingly, then pushing down the square grey button with increasing force. Her hands were suddenly too hot, as if she were wearing gloves. She heard the cameras whir and saw them zooming in on her as she waited. A door slammed somewhere inside, and she placed one hand on her belt. She could hear approaching footsteps. They seemed to take forever. She heard someone cough on the other side of the door, a long, sustained hack and spit. The sound of the locks being disengaged was sharp and dry in the chill air. The man was dressed in a black suit, as if he'd just come back from a funeral. He smiled when he saw her, his eyes roving up and down and across her body, his teeth capped silver and gleaming in the snow glare. She hadn't really thought what to say, was going to pretend that a nuisance call had come in concerning the flat, but the man's stare undid her, and she stood frozen.
"Would you like to come in?"
the man said, his accent cracked and heavily voweled. She hadn't expected this, and was so surprised she didn't know what to say.
Please, come in,
the man said, extending his arm, the knuckles covered in spidery black hair.
I make you some coffee or tea if you prefer.
No, it's okay, she replied. I must have got the wrong house. The man took a step forward, the smile creasing his face.
No, I think you came to exactly the right place, he said. Please.
He beckoned her inside with his arm.
I would like to get to know you. Please come in.
She took a step back, her foot sliding on the icy slick stone. No, thanks. The man continued smiling, but there was something else in his eyes now as he took a step forward.
You sure? I think you would have a nice time if you came in with me. I think I could make you very happy.
Geneva felt her entire body crawl. She shook her head, turned around and walked down the stairs, forcing herself not to break into a run, not to let the panic seep through her skin as the man's eyes tracked her all the way down the street. Chapter 26.
Emily Maxted,
Carrigan said, pinning the blown-up mugshot photo to the whiteboard behind him.
We've managed to identify the 11th victim, but let's not pat ourselves on the back just yet. This only raises a whole new set of questions. What was she doing there? We know she wasn't a nun, and she didn't have any official connection to the convent. Yet the caretaker told us he had seen her frequently and referred to her as the new girl.
The incident room was packed with bodies this afternoon, shuffling in from the cold, their clothes steaming and dripping melted snow. The uniforms hung over and huddled in the back. Carrigan ran down what they had learned from the Maxteds.
We shouldn't cling to the fact that they haven't spoken to her for nearly 2 years. It may be nothing to do with the case, he warned them. Could be just plain old screwed-up family dynamics, but it'll make it harder for us to trace her whereabouts over the last few months.
He brushed his fingers through his beard and shuffled through his notes.
Carlson, did you manage to find out anything about the family?
Carlson unwrapped his long, spindly legs from the stool like a spider and picked up his iPhone.
I looked up the parents, he said. They're both relatively well-known, filthy rich too. The father, Miles Maxted, is a pretty controversial figure in his field. Has some interesting ideas about child raising. There's a Wikipedia page on him. His basic theory seems to be that parental love conditions the child to be unprepared for the heartless cruelty of the world, a place where this love can never be replicated, leaving the child forever longing for something that not only can he never have, but that doesn't even exist.
Yeah, a nice guy all round,
Carrigan said, impressed by Carlson's précis.
What about looking at Facebook, Twitter?
DC Singh suggested.
We should check Emily's social networking site, see what she was up to.
Carrigan chided himself for not having thought of it earlier and nodded.
Miller, anything new to report?
Geneva took a sip of her Coke and updated them on what she had discovered earlier, still unsure as to what it meant, the traces and connections all hazy and just out of reach. She had convinced herself that there was no point mentioning the house on Hatherley Crescent or the smiling man on the other side of the door. Carrigan would dismiss it. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but she had felt something when the door had opened, and she couldn't describe it, even to herself. It wasn't the man, or at least it wasn't just the man. It was as if something dark and trapped had rushed out of the house, sensing its chance. She knew it was stupid, her feelings probably far more to do with Lee's text, and she tried to put it out of her mind as she continued. Mother Angelica, Father McCarthy, and at least 2 of the other nuns who died in the fire were involved in the 1973 Chia Peltek strike. It began as a normal strike, but that first night a bomb went off, inadvertently killing the mine owners' families. The next day, they retaliated, and a lot of people were murdered. No one knows who placed the bomb, but the Scarlet Fire, a Marxist-Leninist group whose members later joined the Shining Path, were suspected. A month later, Mother Angelica was transferred back to London, having only served 3 years of a 5-year residency.
"That's all very interesting," Carrigan said, seeing Geneva's mouth tighten. He could tell she was hungover and irritable, her eyes a little smaller and more pouched than normal. "But it's ancient history."
"How about 16 months ago?" Carrigan's eyes shot up.
"What happened 16 months ago?"
2 of the nuns travelled to Peru. She just about resisted the urge to smile when she saw the look on Carrigan's face. "It gets better," she continued. "On the first trip, 2 nuns flew out to Peru, but only 1 came back." She shuffled through her papers till she found the right one. "I looked up the nuns' travel records. They were in the file Holden sent us. Sister Glenda and Sister Rose travelled to Peru in September of last year. The strange thing is that there's no record of Sister Rose returning. I checked with immigration, and they have her leaving the country but not coming back in. A month later, the convent replaced her with a new nun." "Maybe she liked it so much she decided to stay there," Jennings quipped. "She's a nun. It's not up to her," Geneva replied. "And if she was transferred there, why is there a travel requisition form in her file and not a transfer request?" "What do you think happened to her?" Carrigan asked, his voice careful and soft. "I don't know yet, but it all ties into the convent ceasing their charity work, I'm sure of it. They did this a few weeks after Sister Rose didn't return from Peru. It doesn't make sense. They spent years building up their outreach programs. Why shut them down? With the economic situation as it is, why did they give up their charity work just when it was needed the most?" Carrigan stopped his note-taking. "Do we know why the nuns travelled to Peru?" "I phoned the diocese and spoke to Holden. He told me he would have to get back to me on Sister Rose's whereabouts, but he confirmed that the nuns had gone to attend church conferences in Lima." "But?" Carrigan could see something small and mischievous in Geneva's eyes. "I checked the conferences Holden mentioned and cross-referenced them with the nuns' dates of travel. All 3 conferences were on dates that didn't tally with the nuns' trips." Carrigan looked over at Geneva and shook his head. "It's a good story, but I'm still not convinced it has anything to do with the fire. It's far more likely that the nuns' crusading activities pissed off the wrong people, and that the fire was in retaliation for that." He saw their faces slump further as he updated them on Bird's information. "This man, Victor," Carrigan said, pointing to the photo on the wall behind him, "is now our main suspect, and we need to focus all our energies on finding him. We know he visited the convent. We know he was outside watching while the fire was blazing. I think the nuns pissed off this Duca guy, and he sent his Lieutenant Victor to have a word with them. The fact he made 3 visits to the convent tells me the nuns were none too eager to stand down. Duca gets pissed off and sends someone, maybe Victor again, to torch the convent." He could sense Geneva's stare burning a hole in the side of his head, and ignored it.
"Quinn's just going to love this."
Carlson chuckled, a leering grin across his face.
"Can't wait to see you trying to explain to him how this case just got a whole lot more fucked up than it already was."
"Thank you for that, John," Carrigan replied. "As you're so eager to see the ACC's reaction, I'll make sure you're with me when I hand in my report." Carlson's eyes sputtered momentarily, then muted. Shooting the messenger was one of Quinn's most firmly held beliefs. But Carrigan felt no pleasure in goading his sergeant. Carlson was right. Quinn had wanted an easy solve, a firebug recently out of jail or an accident. But the more they looked into this case, the more it seemed to spin out in contradictory directions, each path at seeming right angles from the others, layered and dense with history and occluded years. "We should at least check the nuns' financial records," Geneva said, and Carrigan turned swiftly, ready to be angry at her, but when he saw her face, the seriousness and weight of her eyes, he stopped and said, "Why?" "For years, the nuns were involved in funding all this outreach work in the community. They were spending a lot of money and then it stops dead. Geneva looked up from her notebook, a hard, bright gleam in her eye. I want to know what they've been doing with all the money they previously would have been spending on good works. Carrigan considered this. It was a good question, and he was disappointed in himself for not having thought of it. We'd need to get a warrant, and Quinn would never allow it. I know, Geneva replied, which is why I took the liberty of asking Berman to see if he could hack into the diocese's server. Carrigan stared at Geneva, then turned his attention to Berman. And can you? Berman avoided Carrigan's gaze, using the opportunity to examine his keyboard. It won't stand up in court, but it's quicker than a warrant. Carrigan thought about this for a moment. He looked around the room. Everyone okay with this? No one blinked or shook their heads. Slowly, everyone nodded. Good, Carrigan said, and turned to Berman. Can you get us into their financial accounts? Yes, I think so, the DC answered. The convent was a registered charity. It existed on donations. That means the records are in there, somewhere. Do it, Carrigan commanded. Berman typed in a string of commands on 2 keyboards at the same time. They all hunched impatiently over the desk as the screen flashed a long list of numbers. It was scary what was out there, Carrigan thought. Every keystroke and kink of your personality, all the words you gushed out drunk at 3 a.m, the fired-off jokes and offhand gossip, and it was all stored and waiting in a cold underground room for someone to retrieve it. A couple of minutes later, Berman nodded imperceptibly and a smile crept across his face. Carrigan almost ripped the page from the printer. He scanned the dense sheet of numbers, then scanned it again because it wasn't at all what he had expected. What is it? Geneva said, noticing the quickening in his features. He passed the account sheet across the table. The nuns had over £1 million in their account as of last month, Carrigan stated, watching everyone's eyes curl in surprise. Berman, can you get their monthly statements? A minute later, more paper came crunching through the printer. Carrigan stared down the long list of figures. Money was coming in every month to the nuns' account. Different sums from several different payees. Berman, I need you to get a list of donors to the convent. Anything over a couple of £100. No problem, he replied, but Carrigan was too ensnared by the balance sheets in his hands to notice. There's a monthly standing order going out of the convent's account, he said, each word slow and deliberate. £20,000 on the 16th of every month. Same destination each time. Berman scanned his screen and copied the sort code and account number of the bank that the money was being paid into, then punched the information into a search engine. He moved his face closer to the screen until his nose was nearly touching it. They could all hear his breathing as the data flashed up. The transfers are all routed to the same place, he said. The sort code refers to a Banco Nacional branch in Cusco. Cusco, Geneva repeated. A small grin escaped the side of Berman's mouth. According to this, the nuns transferred almost £250,000 to Peru last year. Chapter 27. Geneva stood outside the small stone church nestled in a sleepy cul-de-sac in the wilds of Lewisham and smoked a cigarette as the snow filled the folds of her jacket and smudged her lenses. She had been too tired, hungover and red-eyed to put her contacts in that morning, and the weight of her glasses was an unexpected thing. It had been so long since she had last worn them. She had left the briefing buzzing with theories and speculation and spent the last 2 hours glued to the computer screen, zooming and clicking and making notes, the case now pushing her along on its own rhythm. But what she read only confused her further. She didn't know if the events at Chiapeltec had anything to do with the case or if they had nothing to do with it. She wasn't sure how Sister Rose, the missing nun, fitted in. Maybe Carrigan was right, and this was nothing more than a feud taken too far, the nuns naively getting into deep water with some nasty drug dealers. But no, that didn't feel right. She was sure the nuns' activities in Peru were pertinent to the case, despite how persuasive Carrigan's counter-theory had been. She needed more evidence to back up her hunches. This was an unfamiliar and murky world, one she knew nothing about, and she was only beginning to realise how deep and layered and alien it was. She knew she would never understand the case unless she understood the underlying contexts behind it. And so she had called the editor of the Catholic Tribune and asked him to direct her to someone who could help. She stubbed out her cigarette and opened the gate to the church grounds, walking past the cracked gravestones and dead flower beds and up an overgrown winding path to the front door. Her first thought was that Father Spaulding looked like a caricature of a monk, a 10-year-old's Disney version of a brown-robed holy man. Spaulding was extremely bald, extremely short, and extremely fat, a man composed of squashed circles placed atop each other. He had saggy jowls, small, kind eyes, and a nervous laugh. "Detective Sergeant Miller!" His accent was the last thing she'd expected. High and tremulous, yet with a musical lilt to it. An accent only heard in black and white movies, dashing officers gathered together in the mess hall on the eve of a momentous battle. "Do come in!" The silence struck her immediately. Though the church was only a few yards away from the high street, with its crack dealers and boarded-up shop fronts, in here, with the door closed, she could have been in another century. She followed Father Spaulding through a long, narrow corridor, dark with paintings of virgins and popes, and into a surprisingly bright and airy front room. "I was just about to have my lunch," Spaulding said, as he directed her to the wooden table at the centre of the room. "You simply must join me." Geneva pulled out a chair, staring at the food on display. The monk was eating alone, but there were several plates, enough food for 3 or 4 men. Spaulding sat down slowly, hitching his robe and sighing as he carefully placed a napkin on his lap. He pointed to a plate of sliced meat the colour of burnished mahogany. "Those are from a small monastery in Switzerland," he said. "They make the best cured beef in the world. It's so good it really should qualify as a sin." His laugh was full and belly deep, his whole body shuddering. She looked at the food and felt sick. The last hour swirled in her mind. She had finally called Oliver and reluctantly agreed to meet him that night to discuss the issue of the house and the money he owed her. The grease on the monk's lips made her feel queasy, but he kept insisting, and she forced herself, taking a small piece of black bread and a slice of meat. She bit into it hesitantly, and before she knew what she was doing, she was reaching for another helping. The dry and bitter taste which had coated her mouth all morning was replaced by the smoky tang of the beef, the subtle hand-rubbed herbs and peppery spices. Spaulding watched her with amusement as he picked up an olive, then studied it before placing it between his lips. "You said over the phone you were investigating the fire." Geneva nodded, her mouth still too full to attempt speech, and pulled out her notebook. "A most terrible thing," the monk said. "But not for them, of course. They are now sitting at Jesus' side. The problems of the world, the problems of their bodies and brains, all gone." He picked up a dusty green bottle of wine and tilted it towards her. She placed her hand flat across the top of her glass. "Oh, come on now. This food tastes so much better with a little wine." Spaulding filled her glass. The wine looked unusually dark and viscous, and when she took a sip, the flavour was rich, complex and smoky. Maybe the best wine she had ever tasted. "I was looking into Mother Angelica's past," she explained, pulling out the tangled mess of printouts and scrawled notes from her bag. "And I read about the strike at Chiapeltec, the bomb, the ensuing massacre." "Ah, yes," Spaulding nodded. What times those were! Priests and nuns taking up arms, the whole continent seduced by the promises of liberation theology. I saw you wrote several books on the subject, but, to be honest, I don't really understand much about it. Spaulding finished off a slice of salmon, took a sip of wine, and, despite her protestations to the contrary, topped up her glass. No need to be embarrassed. There are not many people in the modern church who know that much about liberation theology anymore. The Vatican have been rather successful in that. She picked up the edge to his words, the way he said this thing out the corner of his mouth. Not fans of it, then? Spaulding laughed. Dear me, no. You could say that, though I would put it a bit more strongly. An idea started to form in her head, and she wrote it down, then took another sip of wine. She hadn't meant to, was trying to slow down, but it tasted so good, and her hangover was finally clearing. Liberation theology is exactly what it says on the tin, Spaulding explained. A theology of liberation. He leaned forward and propped his elbows on the table. It is also an intrinsically South American thing. It follows from the prophetic tradition of the missionaries and the Jesuit Reducciones, having its roots in great men such as Bartolomé de las Casas, Antonio de Montesinos, and Brother Caneca. But it is also a purely modern phenomenon. In the 1950s and 60s, Latin America went through a rapid process of industrialization. Countries that for centuries had been predominantly rural suddenly transformed themselves in a very short space of time. The new factories and sweatshops led to an increased exploitation of the poor. The villagers, who could no longer afford to farm, migrated towards the cities and found work, often under the most brutal of conditions. This led to a series of uprisings in search of a living wage, health and safety restrictions, an end to oppression. Spaulding stopped and looked up at the ceiling. The world often works in contradictory ways, and the uprisings gave the militaries and right-wing political parties the excuse they needed to wrest control of the political machine. Hence you get the years of Latin American dictatorships, the screaming bodies under the football stadium, and black-suited death squads roaming the nighttime jungles. Anyone who complained of injustice or tried to organize the workers was beaten, tortured, and killed. The local parish priests in the villages and countryside saw this violence and oppression with their own eyes, and when they met as a body, they knew that something had to be done, that the church could not stand by and watch its people be destroyed. And so liberation theology was born. Marxism no longer held a monopoly on historical change. Christ had taken over. Geneva looked up from her notes, trying to make sense of all this new information, to squeeze it into the gaps of what she knew about Mother Angelica and the convent. She could see the faint sparkle in Father Spaulding's eyes as he talked about the past, and she briefly wondered if he had been there, in South America, but he didn't look old enough. What did this theology involve? Theology is abstract in the mind, right? Spaulding smiled. Yes, it is. But the priests realized that theology needed a modification, that it was not enough to just stand and witness. Action was necessary. The theologians went back to the Bible, and guess what they found? Their own predicament written in the words of the Gospels. Jesus himself was concerned with these issues. None of this is new. The world changes, but ultimately it is the same. And as they read those familiar words, they saw something freshly revealed in them. They realized that the prescription and instruction for what they needed to do was right there in front of them, and had been for 2,000 years. I'm afraid I'm a bit lost. The Bible was never my strong point, Geneva confessed. Father Spaulding looked at her kindly and smiled. Christ speaks about the preferential option for the poor. The poor and oppressed are preferred by God because they have been done wrong to here on earth. Can you imagine how radical these ideas must have seemed in that context? What followed in the light of this reading was a general move away from contemplation towards action.
This was the big break from previous theology. No longer was prayer enough. Action was needed, and it was needed right here on earth. Why would the church not approve of that? Spaulding gave a derisive snort. Yes, indeed. This was an attempt to replicate Jesus' ministry on earth, to help the most unfortunate. So, why did they repudiate it? Good question. And the answer is, as always, politics. I thought the church was supposed to be above politics. Father Spaulding laughed loudly. God is above politics, but the church is the church of men, and men want to sleep in comfortable beds. The liberation priests were a massive thorn in the side of the prevailing governments. They wanted to organize workers, demand better conditions, stop the exploitation. The exploitation was how these governments made their money, how they lured factories and corporations to their shores. Cheap labor, no red tape, and zero tax. And it saddens me greatly to say that the local hierarchy of the church had very close and unhealthy ties with the regimes. Priests and clergy active in mobilizing and organizing were swiftly sent elsewhere. Many saw this as their chance at martyrdom, and many got their wish. Mother Angelica was one of these liberation theologians, right? She was quite the bright spark in the church's arsenal. Her death... For the first time the monk stumbled, and Geneva could see him choking back a wave of memories. He picked up a napkin and snuffled into it. She spent her early years studying theodicy, the idea that all evil acts are justified by a greater good that only God can see. She wrote her seminary paper on it, but there were rumours of a breakdown at Oxford that trying to reconcile the Holocaust and the atom bomb drove her crazy. The next thing we heard, she was involved in liberation theology, which made sense. Rather than accept evil and exploitation as part of a greater plan, she wanted to fight it. Her first book, Of This World and the Next, was published in 1972, 2 years after she was sent to Peru. Geneva took only the smallest sip from her glass. The wine was far more powerful than she'd expected, and she felt a little light-headed and dizzy. How radical were Mother Angelica's ideas? The church thought them pretty damn radical. That's why they went to the extraordinary step of banning her from the continent. Geneva looked up. Banning her? I thought they'd transferred her for her own safety, that there were death threats against her. Spaulding shrugged. Doubtless there were, and it was a long time ago, and who's to say now what really happened and what didn't? We go where the church sends us. Tomorrow I might be told that I am needed in a remote monastery in Mongolia, and I will pack my bags dutifully, leave my fine wine and Swiss beef behind, and get on the first plane. The church wanted Mother Angelica where she could do the least damage, and so they banned her from South America and transferred her here, where her power would be greatly diminished. Geneva tried, but couldn't begin to imagine this kind of life. The total submission of your desires to a higher power, the utter abnegation of want and need. And she only wrote that one book. Spaulding shook his head. It's the only book that got published, but she spent the rest of her life, both while in South America and then here in London, writing what she considered her most important work. Unfortunately, not many people have seen it. The church barred its publication. Why? Geneva said, thinking back to her conversation with Holden. Hard to say, Spaulding replied, not having seen it. But there are rumours, stories floating around the edges of the theological world that she was attempting to construct a moral calculus. Geneva looked up. A moral calculus? Yes, that was how she referred to it. From what I've heard, it was a totally different book from her first, moving a long way away from the precepts of liberation theology. I've heard it spans over 6,000 pages and is very mathematical in nature. Allegedly, she was trying to work out a foolproof system whereby one could gauge any moral act as to its validity in the eyes of God.
Wow,
Geneva replied. Big task? Spaulding laughed. Yes, it is.
And this was the cause of the diocese's dispute with the convent?
Well, you could call it that, I suppose.
But you wouldn't?
I'm not sure I should be telling you this, Spaulding said, and Geneva could tell this was a phrase he liked using and used often. But after the fire, after what happened, well, there were rumours, more than rumours, in fact, that the convent was going to be excommunicated. Geneva thought back to Holden calling the dispute a small disagreement.
Excommunication? That's pretty serious, right?
It's the strongest punishment the Church can mete out. It means they can no longer perform their duties as nuns, are not allowed to participate in God's sacraments. It's like closing the door on heaven.
And all because of the book she was writing?
No, Spaulding admitted. It would have had to have gone beyond that. Something far more serious, if the diocese had taken steps to excommunicate them. We're talking about the entire convent here, not just Mother Angelica. It's not something the Church does lightly. In that respect, the fire was very convenient for them. There was something about the way he'd said it that made Geneva underline the words in her notebook. She thought about what they'd found out, the nuns' trips to Peru, to conferences that didn't exist, the evidence left behind by the fire.
What about now?
What's the situation like these days in Peru? Are clergy still involved in politics? Spaulding nodded. Though the Church has succeeded in pretending the injustices don't exist, they are still there. Peru now has an elected president and parliament, but nothing has really changed. If anything, the situation of the poor is even worse. The government has sold off most of the valuable land to foreign corporations. There's no regulation. Entire areas are being deforested, rivers polluted, and the Indians are finding the very land is disappearing from under them. Spaulding shook his head and took a sip of his wine. Add drugs to the mix, and you have a terrible situation.
Drugs?
Geneva moved her chair a few inches closer to the table. Peru is the most productive coca-growing region in the world. This is not a good thing for the people who live there, as you can imagine. Men with guns in open-backed trucks, army incursions, farmers forced to grow coca by the cartels, then punished by the government for the same. It's a mess that no one has the resolve to do anything about. Geneva shook her head, grateful once again that she lived in a country where things were not so fucked up.
Do you know what happened to Sister Rose? She asked. The convent sent her to Peru in September of last year, but I can't find any record of her coming back into the country.
Well, that's because she didn't come back, Father Spaulding said.
What do you mean?
Geneva felt a hot rush tumble through her as she clenched her notebook tightly. Father Spaulding steepled his hands. When he spoke, his voice was lower and surprisingly grave. A terrible tragedy. Her body was never found. She's still missing. Probably will be until some farmer ploughs his fields and discovers her body.
You think she was killed?
Geneva said, leaning forward.
Isn't it possible she just decided she'd had enough of being a nun and made her own way?
Possible, yes, but not very likely, Father Spaulding replied. When she went missing, she was on a field trip with a priest from the local parish. 2 weeks later, they found the priest's head. Someone had left it in the front yard of the local church. She stopped at a coffee shop on her way back to the station and bolted down 2 macchiatos, trying to stop her head from spinning. The wine was sitting hot and deep in her belly, and her head felt pleasantly light. Father Spaulding's words streaked through her mind. The worlds he'd conjured up, theology and the plunge into thousands of years of history. Lonely old men poring over brittle parchments, trying to decipher the meaning of the world hidden in the obscurities of text. And she thought of Mother Angelica and her book, and what a challenge and rude shock it would have been to the Church to have such ideas put forward, but, more than that, to have them put forward by a woman. She entered the station to update the incident log and type up the notes from her interview. It was early afternoon, and she was glad everyone was out, her feet still a little unsteady as she walked down the long carpeted corridor towards the incident room. She saw him walking towards her, and it was too late to pretend she hadn't. D.S. Carlson nodded curtly as he passed. Then she heard him stop and turn. She wanted to disappear into the ladies, but it was 3 doors down.
"Miller, I was just looking for you."
Carlson was wearing a neat 3-piece worsted suit and a tang of bitter aftershave. He stood right next to her, leaning into her space, defeating her obvious and pointless attempts to turn away.
"I need you to sign some of the report sheets,"
he said, hovering over her as she squirmed and tried to answer him without opening her mouth.
"Can't it wait?"
"No. Branch wants everything up to date."
She walked a couple of paces ahead of him. She could hear Carlson trailing behind her. She sat down and started signing off forms. Carlson standing only a foot away, wrinkling his nose and trying very hard not to smile. She gave him the completed sheets and was about to leave when he said,
"Can you smell something?"
"No," she replied, trying to talk down to the table.
"Funny. Smells like someone knocked over a bottle of cheap wine."
Carlson shook his head in a gesture of mock bemusement, winked, and walked away. Chapter 28. Hyde Park was a blaze of white, fat clumps of dirty snow hanging on the branches of skinny trees. A cold snap in the wind as it came careening down from the pond. Carrigan bunched up his jacket and lowered his face against the stinging air as he made his way towards the Serpentine. He was thinking about Emily as he trudged through the snow. How did she fit in? Was her presence at the convent no more than coincidence, a cruel synchronicity to send them spinning off into dead ends? She didn't fit into the theory that the nuns had irked Duca and garnered his displeasure. She didn't fit in with Geneva's ideas on Peru. Either Emily had nothing to do with the case, or she had everything to do with it. The gallery's foyer was almost empty, only a grungy student sitting behind a desk, desperately trying to keep his eyes open on the book he was reading. It was too cold to see art, too cold to stand and stare at paint and canvas, and the student must have thought Carrigan had wandered in here by mistake, perhaps assuming there was a cafe, somewhere to sit and escape the wind. "Hi." He turned from the rows of artfully designed magazines and saw her. Donna was standing to the right of the front desk, one leg slightly crooked, her brown leather boots dark with snow. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Her hair was loose and kept getting into her eyes, and she brushed it away and said, "I'm glad you did." They entered the gallery, several interlinked spaces, empty of everything but them and the art on the walls. Square light boxes filled the first room, chunky plastic devices about 2 feet by 2 with bulbs blazing behind them, illuminating a set of fast food images. As they shuffled mutely into the room, Carrigan was blinded by luminescent photos of Big Macs, golden fried chicken, anemic pizzas, and glistening kebabs. And he realised that these images were the ones used as menus above the tills of takeaway places. The room was covered in them, sweating light and colour, these everyday images now isolated and reframed and made faintly mystical. Carrigan didn't know if it was the art, but it was making him hungry. "I hope you don't mind meeting here," Donna said. "I just needed... God, I didn't realise how much I needed to get out of the house until..." She reached for a handkerchief and dropped it on the floor and got to her knees and stumbled as she picked it back up. He could see the broken blood vessels in her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, the soft downward curve of her lids, chapped and red-rimmed. She smelt of lavender and wine and something else beneath it all, a sharp and lovely citric fragrance, some expensive perfume or moisturiser. "I'm sorry. I couldn't speak earlier back at the house. It's like I'm still expecting her to call." Donna's lips were stained blood red, and he could tell she'd been drinking before coming here. She turned away from the wall and faced him. "I just can't believe I'll never see her again." "I know," he replied, remembering a day 20 years ago when he had first entered the country of grief and never again. "I could tell you you'll get over it, that time heals all wounds and all that, but I'm not going to lie to you. Your life will never be the same. You'll always look back and see a clear demarcation. Everything will take place in reference to before and after. You should maybe think about seeing someone." Her sudden laughter surprised him. "That's the last thing I need. I grew up with psychiatrists for parents." Her smile collapsed, and he saw the years crash up against her. "Been there, done that, and it's not worth the paper it's written on. Besides, Emily's dead. There's nothing that's going to change that, is there?" "We'll find out who did this." Carrigan moved closer, until he could feel the heat and burn of Donna's breath against his skin. "I know that's not going to be much of a consolation, that Emily will still be gone, but I promise you she will be avenged." Donna placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you for saying that, but I still don't understand it. Any of it. What was she doing in a convent? That's just not like Emily at all." He pulled away and turned to face the opposite wall, a succulent burger in pornographic close-up, each sesame seed and bead of moisture visible under the relentless light. "The more you can tell us about her, the more likely we are to find out why she was there." "I lied to you." Donna put out her hand and steadied herself against the wall. "When I said I hadn't talked to her for a couple of years, that wasn't true." "Why didn't you tell us when we were at the house?" Carrigan said as gently as possible. "Because I didn't want my father to know," Donna replied, and she seemed embarrassed by this somehow. "Because Emily swore me to secrecy." "When did you last speak to her?" Donna looked any place but at Carrigan, her eyes restless and heavy. "She called me a couple of weeks ago." "A couple of weeks ago?" Carrigan tried to control his breathing. "What did she want?" "The usual." Donna sighed. "She only ever called when she needed help. She was always getting into trouble, and we were always getting her out of it." "What kind of trouble?" Donna shrugged. "You name it. Emily... Well, you probably know by now that Emily had problems. She'd had problems since we were little girls, and we all thought that as she got older they would go away, but they didn't. They only got worse." Donna reached into her handbag and took out her phone. She pressed several buttons, then tilted the screen towards Carrigan. "I took this a couple of weeks ago, when we met." Donna's eyes shaded as she realised it had been for the last time. "You never know, do you?" "No, you don't." Carrigan took the phone and stared at the photo under the flickering fluorescence. Emily was sitting in a pub, her arms propped up against the table, a nearly full pint glass cradled in her right hand. She wore heavy powder blue eyeliner and had a piercing through her left nostril, a small bronze hoop. Her hair was pink, and the sudden blush of colour was shocking against her white skin. Her expression was soft, a world away from the bitter scowl of the mugshot, and you could tell she wasn't looking at the camera, but at her sister. "Did she say what kind of trouble she was in?" Donna put the phone back in her handbag.
She sounded really strung out. We met at King's Cross. She was always calling me when she was in trouble, but normally she only needed money. This time was different. She was scared, and Emily was never scared. And when I said something about how it'd all work out in the end, she laughed and told me that some things cannot be righted, no matter how hard you try. She said she had done something very stupid, but she wouldn't tell me what. I asked her if she needed money. She said money wouldn't solve this.
Donna twirled a lock of hair round her finger, her lips tight and pale. But she didn't tell you anything about the trouble she was in? Donna shook her head.
I should have known, damn it. I knew her better than anyone else, and I thought she was just being melodramatic. I didn't...
She hung her head and stared at her shoes. Her body seemed to fold in on itself. Can I have a copy of this photo? It was the most recent image he'd seen of Emily, and would be much more useful to them than a 3-year-old mugshot.
Donna nodded. I'll email a copy to your phone.
I wouldn't even know where to begin with that. Carrigan pulled out his mobile and showed it to her. It always managed to raise a smile, and this time was no exception. She stared at the chunky black box, already an antique, and smiled. What happened between your parents and Emily? Why haven't they spoken for a couple of years? The question took Donna by surprise. She looked up at Carrigan, and he could see the screaming arguments, slammed doors, and sleepless nights burning through her memory. The things she stood for? The things she said? You know how families are. Carrigan nodded, but, in truth, he had no idea. His father had disappeared from his life when he was 16, and his mother certainly wasn't like any of his friends' mums, not with her rosary beads and Reader's Digests, her spotted half-blind Jack Russell, and the permanent scowl etched on her face by her husband's abandonment. She must have been very angry and hurt by your father disinheriting her. Donna laughed a thin, harsh laugh. The will? She didn't care about that. Money meant nothing to Emily. Carrigan nodded, thinking only someone who had grown up with too much of it could ever think that. What were the disagreements with your father about? What weren't they about? Donna replied as they entered the second room, and Carrigan was surprised to find the fast food images replaced by the illuminated face of Muhammad Atta in each light box, his expression subtly altered between one and the next. Everything she said or did, our father saw as some kind of failure on his part. Remember, both our parents are child psychiatrists. When your kid grows up to be something other than you expected, it becomes a professional failure as well as a personal one. She raised her voice and changed pitch and stressed certain syllables to ironize what she was saying and distance herself from the memory of it. But Carrigan thought it only enmeshed her deeper in her own inescapable history. And he felt bad, because he had imagined her life a gilded one, money and breeding and good luck. He should have known better. Should have known that sorrow and pain lurked everywhere and came for everyone. They left the gallery and crossed the winding strip of road that bisected the park, heading towards the small cafe overlooking the Serpentine Pond. Carrigan bought them both coffees, and as he walked out onto the terrace, the trees silver and still, the lake almost frozen, he saw Donna sitting and facing the water, her hair wind-blown in a swirl, eyes lost in wistful haze. "Thank you," she said, raising the cup to her lips and blowing on it, white, wispy vapours escaping into the chill air. A Labrador puppy came bounding up the path and stopped, tail wagging, by Donna's feet. She ran her hands through its thick, downy fur and stroked it, and, for the first time, Carrigan saw her as she had been before he had come and broken the news, and it pierced him deeply that she would only ever be this carefree and giddy in fleeting moments, and that the memory of her dead sister would be like a lens through which she would forever view the world. He thought of his own dead, voices whispering to him in the crackle of night, the friends and lovers gone to earth and silence. You said that Emily was always getting into trouble. When did this start?
From very early on, Donna replied. She was always in trouble at school, with her teachers, classmates, even her friends. It only got worse as she got older. She kept skipping classes, smoking and drinking during lunch breaks, seeing boys, getting caught, always getting caught as if that had been the intention all along. Everything that life threw at her just made her more furious, and she would go off into these week-long depressions, sit in her room with the lights out, under the covers, moaning and crying. As she got older, these periods got longer. Father and Mother tried everything. Sent her to behavioural specialists, tried all sorts of pills. You can imagine what it did to them, having to send their own child to a specialist. It was the greatest sign of their failure as professionals and as parents. She made several attempts at taking her own life. The usual teenager slashing her wrists, cries for help. But Father and Mother ignored her, believing that was the best way to deal with it. And then, one day, when she was 16, everything changed. She'd gone to a summer camp the school had set up for kids who'd fallen behind. She'd been to these kind of places before and always ended up running away or assaulting a teacher, but this time something extraordinary happened. She stayed the whole length of the course and came back, and it was like she was a new Emily.
How do you mean?
She'd met a couple of older students at the camp, and they'd introduced her to the world of politics. At first, we were all so relieved she'd finally found something which motivated and interested her. But what we didn't realise was that she had only managed to find a new receptacle for her rage and fury at the world. She began going to student meetings, small groups in dusty after-hours classrooms, watching atrocity videos and international news reports, rolling thin cigarettes and drinking cider, discussing capitalism and exploitation. She would sit at the dinner table and rant non-stop about America and imperialism, spinning wild conspiracy theories, believing that everyone who didn't agree with her was complicit. You have to understand, Emily grew up in that house, surrounded by all that money, and in the streets she saw men sleeping in doorways and fishing their dinners from bins outside restaurants, and it made her angry and ashamed and determined to do something about it. She was so passionate and brave and principled. I always envied her so much for that.
And you? Carrigan inquired gently. After all, you grew up in the same house.
I was always a little less engaged with the world than Emily, and I also learned early on that the world isn't fair, and nothing we can do will change that. She looked away, as if Carrigan had caught her in some shameful act. We were still close, though, she and I, and we went to university at Leeds together, but it was never the same. I chose to study English, she took courses in politics and history. She began going on marches and protests, getting into trouble with the police. She joined a radical animal rights group and went on hunt-sab missions. I rarely saw her any more on campus, and she barely ever came home. Then things got worse. You never think they can, but they always do.
A slow, baleful smile appeared on Donna's face for a brief moment.
It was the Easter break of our final year. I'd prevailed on her to come home for the holidays. We were having lunch, and a massive argument blazed between Father and Emily over something stupid and meaningless. Foreign policy, oil, something that had nothing to do with our lives. She called him a hypocrite. Father ordered her out of the house. In the middle of Easter lunch. She took her things, dropped out of uni, and disappeared. It was the first of her many disappearances. We didn't hear from her again for almost a year. Donna took a deep breath and brushed the tears from her eyes. She finished her coffee and wiped her top lip. I'm sorry for bringing all this back. Carrigan reached his hand out, then, thinking better of it, pulled it back. Don't be, Donna replied. They might be bad memories, but they're still memories. He could see a deep sadness settle behind her eyes, and he changed tack. Did you know any of her friends, boyfriends?
Anyone she was especially close to? Donna shrugged as she watched a squirrel lean and quiver in the wind. I tried to avoid them when I could. They were not the kind of people I liked socializing with, always so angry and bitter about the world, and so full of unrealistic expectations and empty slogans. They just depressed me. Besides, people came and went all the time, found other things to get angry about. The only constant was Jeff. Jeff Shorter. He was Emily's first proper boyfriend. They met in her second year at Leeds and moved in together during her finals. They broke up last year. She told me he was acting all weird about it. Carrigan leaned forward, the chair legs scraping against the gravel. Weird in what way? She didn't say, but it doesn't surprise me. When I first met Jeff, I thought he would be good for her, drag her out of the swamp she'd sunk herself into. But if anything, he only made her worse. How? Donna sighed and crossed her legs. Jeff's one of those identikit guilty rich white boys. His parents own some massive castle in Herefordshire, been in the family for centuries and all that, and he dabbles in all this activism and protest as a way to get back at his parents and his upbringing, and to convince himself he isn't exactly like them. She snuffled and finished the remains of her drink. They never realise that for other people it's a matter of life and death. I take it you're not his biggest fan. He was a bad influence on Emily. He encouraged all her craziness and rage. I think it even turned him on. You should talk to him, Donna said, facing Carrigan. He spent much more time with her in London than I did. He'd know who she hung out with, what she was up to. She looked down at the green water and hung her head. Whatever trouble Emily got herself into, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Jeff was behind it. Chapter 29. She'd always hated this pub, which of course was why he chose it. He was late, and that wasn't anything new either. Geneva waited, a white Russian cooling her palms, the day's notes and typed reports spread out in front of her. Before talking to Father Spaulding, she was almost ready to be convinced that Carrigan was right, but the monk's story had changed that. What she knew for certain was that Holden had lied. He had told her the dispute between the convent and diocese was nothing important, and yet Spaulding had said that the nuns were on the verge of being excommunicated. What could have led to such an extreme measure? She thought about the bank transfers, the trips to Lima, the missing nun, ignoring the swelling noise and merriment surrounding her. She reread interview transcripts as people laughed and kissed and bought each other drinks, their faces red and bright, clothes smeared wet and shiny with snow. She closed her notebook and pulled out her phone. "We know about Chiapeltec," she said, and heard Holden inhaling sharply on the other end of the line. "We know that the nuns weren't travelling to Peru for conferences, and we know about Sister Rose's disappearance. We need to talk to Father McCarthy. He was a regular visitor and can tell us what the convent was up to. He was also the last person to be seen leaving the building." "I'm afraid that's impossible," Holden replied. "There are other ways to find him," Geneva said. "Ways you may not like." There was a pause, a staticky silence which made her think he'd hung up. "Why do I get the impression you're not dying to know who killed your nuns?" "Your impressions are of no concern to me," Holden replied. "And Father McCarthy is on retreat, and therefore cannot be disturbed. This is something we take very seriously in the church." "And we take the murder of 11 people very seriously, Mr. Holden. Why has he suddenly decided to go on retreat? What kind of retreat are we talking about?" There was a measured silence, thick with hum and crackle. "It's a delicate matter," Holden finally said, and his voice now seemed to be coming from further away. "So is the case of a missing nun which the diocese refuses to acknowledge." "Damn it!" Holden snapped. "You won't give up, will you?"
She could hear him sigh and tap something against his desk. Father McCarthy has taken time off to face up to certain issues. She was about to answer, then stopped, realizing what Holden was saying between the words. Are you telling me he's in rehab, not on retreat? That he just decided to check in the day after the fire? I'm not saying anything, Miss Miller. I'm just explaining the situation. Then why can't we just speak to him? These facilities are private and can only function if they remain so. Now, if you... Geneva was no longer listening. A date caught her eye in one of the files. A date she had not paid attention to before. Something tripped, some switch in her brain, and she ended the call and pulled out the papers from her files until she found the one detailing the nun's recent trips to Peru. She checked the dates against the travel documents. I'm glad to see you're finally going through the papers. She snapped her head up and was startled to see Oliver peering down at her, a smile that was all teeth spread across his face. She quickly cleared the pages off the table, almost spilling her drink, Oliver catching it just in time, grinning, saying, What would you do without me, Geneva? She was about to answer, but there was no point. Everything she said, Oliver would use as further ammunition against her. 3 years of marriage had taught her that, if nothing else. It's work, she snapped, not making eye contact, shuffling the papers back into her bag, wishing she was anywhere but here. Oliver sat down and took a long sip of his bitter, the foam covering his top lip, his perfect fingernails tapping against the glass. Just looking at him made her feel queasy. The eroded years and restless nights coming back to her, the time they'd spent up north, her thinking this was the thing she'd been waiting for all these years, and then seeing him for what he really was, and knowing she had made the worst decision of her life. That long year of fretting and plotting and getting the nerve up. Telling him one night, her bag's already packed, a friend outside waiting to collect her. And yes, that night, the screaming, fists and hurled accusations. Then came the threats and ravaged pleas, running out of the house and into her friend's car. Oliver's voice receding as they wound through the narrow streets of the spa town towards the train station, where she hid in a photo booth, hoodie covering her face until the train arrived. Then the slow, stifled journey south, and the final humiliation, asking her mother if she could stay with her for a while. You're looking good, Oliver said, tearing her from the onrushing past. Not easy for a woman to keep up with the years. Like all his compliments, even when they were still in love, this one came with hooks and barbs attached. Can't say the same for you, she replied, and though she'd said it to spite him, she realised that he really had aged. His good looks forming a hard shell over his bones, the youthful glimmer of danger in his eyes now sublimated to something feral and cunning, something you know to get away from as soon as you see it. Always the charmer, Geneva. Good to see you haven't changed. He had a packet of cheese and onion crisps ripped open in front of him. He stuffed a handful into his mouth and continued talking. Remember the last time we met like this? Geneva nodded, hoping it would end this part of the conversation, but Oliver wasn't prepared to let it go. I think you said you loved me and we'd be together forever. That was a long time ago. Oliver crunched some more crisps, and his voice turned hard and cold. You left me, Geneva. Jesus, you left me. You don't know how much that hurt. This is what you called me up for? She splashed the glass down, the liquid sloshing and spilling all over the table, but she didn't care. She was certain everyone in the room was looking at them, all these happy, celebrating couples, watching her and Oliver bicker and blame across a pub table. Look, Oliver, I'm busy. You called me up, said you wanted to sort this thing out. Just you and me, no lawyers or any of that, and all you're doing is fucking reminiscing. Being a cop hasn't exactly made you into a nice person. Who the fuck wants a nice person, Oliver?
I am what I always was. You call me up out of the blue last year, tell me you're taking the house away from me. What the fuck do you expect? He took a folded sheet of paper from a leather briefcase by his feet. He carefully smoothed it out on the table. I expect you to sign this, is what I expect. It's the best deal you're going to get. She took the paper from him, scanned it quickly, and saw that nothing had changed. His lawyer suing for the proceeds of the house, even though they'd bought it together. Oliver had paid the deposit, and she'd paid the monthly repayments. The divorce had finally come through a couple of months ago. The house sold, but the money was still locked in litigation. I need that money, Oliver, she said, immediately hating herself for having revealed so much to him. I know you do. He smiled, flecks of crisps dancing across his teeth. Sign now, and you'll get £10,000. You're joking? She stared up at him and saw that he wasn't. The house sold for $500,000. She glanced back down at the contract, reading through the dense technical language, feeling her face burning up with each word. She wanted to be through with this, to never see or hear from Oliver again. But her equity in the house was the only savings she had. Without it, she'd never be able to buy another flat. She looked up at him and saw that he was enjoying this, a gleeful spark animating his face. You should do it for your mother, Geneva, if not for me. The sudden change in topic threw her off balance, and she wrapped her fingers tightly round her empty glass. What's Katrina got to do with it? How much money do you have in your savings? How long do you think it'll last? Oliver asked. I can drag this through the courts for months, and if I win, which I will, you'll be liable for all costs, and, since your mother was your guarantor on the house, what you can't pay will be taken from her. She stared at him, stunned. You looked into our finances. It's what I do, Geneva, remember? It's my job. He leaned forward across the table, and she could smell his breath and see the curl of satisfaction on his top lip. She closed her eyes and felt her stomach lurch. She thought of her mother fleeing from Czechoslovakia, working nights behind the counter of a cheap hotel to save for a flat. She picked up the contract and ripped it in half, then ripped it in half again. Good enough for you? She threw the shredded paper across the table, oblivious to the stares and startled looks she was receiving from the other drinkers. Take me to court if you want, she said. Bring as many lawyers as you can, but I'm telling you now, watch your back. Are you threatening me? Oliver said in mock outrage, the tone he'd increasingly used in those final months of their marriage. Geneva smiled a thin, pale smile. Yes, I am. You do one thing wrong. You slip up in any conceivable way, and I'll make sure you'll go down for it. I may not have your money or connections, but I have friends up there in North Yorks as well as the Met. They'll be watching you. Remember that. The wet slap and pound of her shoes on the pavement beat in time with her heart. She'd come to the meeting prepared and unwilling to lose her composure, and yet 5 minutes with Oliver could undo all her best intentions. She felt a rippling fury running through her body, as if a layer of skin had been stripped off. She stopped at the corner of the high street, pulled out her cigarettes and lit one. She dragged hard and felt her heart rate slow, the buzzing in her brain begin to settle. She watched the clasped forms of couples drifting in and out of pubs or huddling in freezing bus stops, their arms wrapped tightly around each other, and she looked away. She had no one she could turn to for advice, no one she could tell. There was a dive bar a few streets away, and it made a whole lot more sense than going back to her empty living room and falling asleep on the sofa again. She walked past the swarming pubs and all-night grocery shops, then cut down an alley which connected the two high streets, thinking about the case so that she wouldn't keep thinking about Oliver. She knew Carrigan had been right when he'd said that the intersection of the nuns and Emily would prove to be the key. How had they made contact?
Geneva couldn't even begin to imagine. They came from such different backgrounds, but at some particular moment in time they had met, and that meeting had resulted in 11 dead bodies. She was still thinking about this when she looked up, and there he was. 50 feet ahead of her, motionless, blocking the alley. She squinted against the bright streetlights, but could make out only his shadow. She should have known Oliver wouldn't let her get away so easily. That had never been his style. But this was something else, an escalation she'd glimpsed in his face earlier, sending letters, bombarding her phone, and now following her out here. She stopped and waited for him to move, but he did not move. She waited for him to speak, to light a cigarette, pull out his phone, anything that might explain why he was standing still in the middle of an alleyway. But there was no telltale flicker of light or comforting series of digital beeps. Sirens wailed and faded into the night behind her. She felt for her belt, but there was nothing there. She had checked in her truncheon and mace when she'd signed off for the day. "Oliver," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" She took a couple of steps forward. The angle of the streetlight shifted. The man standing in the alley wasn't Oliver. She stood, struck and still, as his shadow emerged from the blinding glare, and she saw that he was both shorter and wider than her ex-husband. Her heart started beating in her ears, a loud tidal pulse she tried to drown out. The man hadn't moved, but he was looking directly at her, a faint smile on his face. She turned around, ready to retreat, and saw that another man was blocking her exit. He was much taller than the first man, and he was coming towards her. She spun around and froze, and looked at the short man, the eagle tattoo spreading down his neck. He returned her look, grinned, and took a step forward. She glanced up at the fences bordering the alley, topped with glass or razor wire, impossible to scale, and knew that her only chance was in making the first move. The men were getting steadily closer, taking their time, teasing it out, knowing she had nowhere to run. Eagleneck looked fast and vicious, but the other man looked slow and clumsy despite his height. There was no time to reach for her phone, no one to hear her screams. She tensed her legs and fists and ran at the tall man, seeing a gap to his side, her feet slipping on the pavement as she faked right and ducked left. But the man had anticipated her, and he twisted and shuffled and blocked her run. She felt as if she had slammed into a brick wall, all the air exploding from her lungs in one crushed breath. She swung uselessly with her fist, but the tall man effortlessly trapped it in his palm, gently crushing all the resistance out of her. Eagleneck's breathing turned erratic and heavy as he approached, the hot animal smell of his presence making it all seem suddenly very real. Geneva looked in his eyes and could tell that her life didn't mean anything to him, and that he would just as soon snuff it out as he would a burning match, and she realized she was scared. Scared as she had never been before in the job, knowing she was looking at a new kind of adversary. The tall man let go of her fist and secured her arms, making it impossible for her to move. Eagleneck came to a stop beside her and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling through his dark stubble and disappearing into the night. "Let go of me!" She struggled and writhed and twisted, but the tall man's grip didn't falter. "I'm police!" The two men both laughed, a thick, guttural sound that echoed through the alley. A million horror-film deaths flashed through her brain, and it was too late to wish she had never seen all those movies, as her vision filled with chainsaws and blood, the sharp glitter of knives, and fragile delicacy of human skin. Eagleneck leaned in until his nose was almost touching hers, and inhaled deeply, as if drinking the air. Geneva tried to scream, but he placed his oily palm across her lips, and she could suddenly taste his cigarette and smell his breath, garlic and beer, the rough feel of his skin against her own. He held her mouth and moved her head from side to side, as if assessing a dog's pedigree. Gently, he inserted 3 fingers into her mouth, pushing past her teeth and gums. His fingers probed and stroked the inside of her cheeks, his thumb holding down her tongue so forcefully that she could feel his pulse beating in her mouth. She flinched at the sharp rub of his stubble as he pressed his face against hers, and then she saw him reach down and unzip his fly. She could hear buses hissing to a stop down the high street only 100 yards away, TVs blaring game shows from the flats above her, raised voices shouting into mobile phones, and then all she heard was a faint trickling on the pavement, and suddenly her right leg was warm and wet. She opened her eyes and looked down to see the short man directing a long stream of piss at her legs. It smelt rank and sour. It seemed to go on forever. She closed her eyes, but she could still feel the hot gush of his urine and hear it splashing against the pavement under her. When he was finished, he shook off the last few drops and zipped himself back up. He let out a long sigh of relief, then took a step closer, his face less than an inch from hers.
There are no second chances.
She spat in his face and was glad to see the shock and fury in his eyes. He grabbed her hair and used it to pull her head down, twisting the strands until she thought she was going to pass out. He punched her once in the stomach. The other man let go of her arms, and she fell heavily to the floor, her eyes fluttering and fading from focus as her face hit the cold pavement. Chapter 30. The relentless muffled drumming of the shower echoed through the walls of the flat. Carrigan stared out the window at the falling snow and tried to ignore the sound. He made himself instant coffee in the kitchen, rooting through the unfamiliar cupboards and products of another person's life, made her tea, turned on the heating, and kept his mouth shut. He'd found her in the alley, crouched into a ball, shaking and holding tightly onto the phone she had called him from. She couldn't meet his eyes as her voice trembled, stumbled and stuttered, telling him what had happened, the men in the alley, the fight with Oliver. And he'd said it was okay, putting a finger to her lips, lifting her off the wet floor and placing her into the back seat of his car. She'd been in the shower for nearly an hour. She'd had several successive showers. Every so often he could hear the wet scamper of her feet and cessation of noise, only to be replaced by the swirling rush of water rolling down the drain as she brushed her teeth over and over again. It had seemed rude to leave. It had seemed wrong. And so he'd sat and watched the snow swirl and spin, and made hot drinks, trying to swallow the red-hot spike burning through his chest. The fact they would do something like this to one of his officers. The fact they would do this to Geneva. She came out, towel-wrapped and skin-wrinkled, and looked at him and looked at the flat, and went back into the bathroom and locked the door behind her. There were copies of the convent investigation file spread across her coffee table, scribbled notes, typed reports, photos from the morgue. She wasn't supposed to have made copies or brought them home with her, but Carrigan understood. "Thank you." Her voice startled him, the way it didn't sound like her at all. She was wearing a red robe, and her hair was loose and smeared wet across her face. "We should call this in, if you're ready," he said, and it was too late for him to take it back as he saw a sharp flicker ignite the corners of her eyes. "I can't do that." He didn't want to push her. He knew these moments were not like other moments, but he also knew that if she were to change her mind and report it later, vital forensic evidence would be lost. "No one will think any different of you." The look she gave him made the words die in his throat, useless and empty. "You don't really believe that, do you?" She went over to the fridge, her wet feet snapping against the floor, and took out a litre of duty-free tequila that looked like bottled Starlight. She picked up 2 mugs and poured herself a large measure and swiped it back, her eyes turning fuzzy for a brief moment. "Everyone will be super nice to me, which is fucking terrible, but worse, behind my back, when I'm not there, in the canteen or the pub, they'll be talking about the incident. You know that as well as I do. They'll start with how awful it is. Then they'll get to speculating what really happened, what those brutes did to me. And then they'll have had a few drinks and start wondering, was there something I could have done to help myself? Because no one, least of all cops, wants to admit that there are some situations where there's nothing you can do. She refilled the mug and took 3 quick sips. And don't forget, I'm a woman. They'll use that as their excuse. This is what happens when we put women on the front line and all that crap. I'm not going to report it, and I don't want to talk about it any more. She slumped down on the sofa beside him and passed him the other mug. I want to drink away the fucking memory of tonight, all of it. The taste of his fingers. Oliver. I want to forget it happened, for a few hours at least. If you want to join me, that would be nice. They drank the alcohol neat and fast. It burned and flamed as it rolled down their throats. Can we talk about it at least? Just you and me? She refilled the mugs. What do you want to know? Did you recognise them? Geneva turned towards Carrigan and nodded. She lifted the mug to her lips, but her hand trembled, and most of it spilt down the front of her robe, and she didn't seem to notice. The one with the eagle tattoo. He was the one who did... She looked down at her legs. Who did this? The other man I didn't recognise. Shit. Carrigan slammed down the drink, coughing and shaking and gripping the edge of the sofa. What did they say to you? Geneva tucked her feet underneath a small tartan blanket, as if she could make herself disappear within its folds. There are no second chances. It must mean we're getting close, Carrigan said, looking down at the floor. You're still hanging on to the theory this is over the nuns' involvement in cleaning up the neighbourhood? He looked at her sharply, then muted his eyes. We know Victor works for Duca, an Albanian crime boss who runs drugs in our area. The nuns were mobilising the community against drug dealers and petty crime. Victor and Eagleneck attacked me in the ruins. Eagleneck just assaulted you. I think that speaks for itself. He looked at her and smiled. I know you disagree, and that's fine. It's always dangerous to stick to only one avenue of investigation. That's how mistakes get made. But we also need to judge the evidence accordingly. Victor has to be our main priority, and through him, Duca. We have to get him before something like this happens again. He saw her body shake at the mention of what had occurred earlier. 20 years I've been doing this, and this is the first time something like this has happened. She looked at him as she poured another drink. You say that like there's a code. A line even criminals shouldn't cross. I used to think there was. She raised an eyebrow at that and said, You think things are getting worse? Carrigan nodded. Every generation thinks that. He took the bottle from her clenched fingers and held it between his hands. Maybe every generation's right, and it's getting steadily worse all the time. Do you really believe that? She said, intrigued and a little unsettled by the resignation in his voice. We have these great new technological advances. DNA, CCTV, all the rest, but none of it stops the crime. It's only good to us afterwards. Sometimes I think all we are is janitors, clearing up the mess after everyone else has gone home. At least the nuns were doing something. She leaned across the sofa and reached for an ashtray. God, you approve, don't you? She said, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. The neighbourhood improved after they began their community work. Residents became more involved. Property prices went up, and street crimes were down 50% until the nuns decided to stop it all a year ago. They were putting into practice what they believed in. In their minds, they weren't breaking any laws. The laws they subscribe to, ultimately, are God's laws, not man's. But that's exactly the justification everyone uses. Vigilantes, illegal downloaders, terrorists, you name it. Carrigan nodded in agreement. We have to face up to the fact people don't trust our laws anymore.
There's a growing discontent, don't tell me you haven't noticed. A disillusion with the prevailing structures of law and government, the likes of which we haven't seen before. Look at how many empty shops there are on every high street. Construction projects left unfinished. Men sleeping in doorways and bus stops. Look at people's faces, and you see a stunned desperation there. It all happened so quickly. Money fell, and no one understands quite how or why it did, only that their lives had been staked and lost over a financial roulette wheel. I don't know if you're being extremely cynical or extremely prescient. Carrigan shrugged, and Geneva watched him as he worried the dulled ring on his left hand, seemingly unaware of what he was doing, turning it between his fingers as if it were a rosary. "How come you still wear it?" she said, before she could think twice about it. "Never had a reason to take it off." He glanced down at the small gold band and twirled it twice more to ease the pressure. "You loved her a lot," Geneva said, and it wasn't a question. "Far more than I thought I did." "What happened?" she asked, then quickly brought her hand up to her mouth. "I can't believe I just said that. I'm so sorry. I must be a lot drunker than I realise." "Don't be." Carrigan knocked back the remainder of his tequila, his eyes burning fierce and bright. "Louise made a decision. That was all there was to it," he said, thinking of the days following her death, the way the flat seemed both larger and smaller, expanding and contracting with the hot, burning shock of his loss. She'd planned it carefully. I only found out later when I talked to her doctor. A couple of months previously, she'd been to see him about an ache she kept having. He sent her for tests. The tests returned, and he sat her down and talked to her, and gave her 2 years as his best prognosis. She went home and thought about it for a month and made her decision. She wanted to spare me the agony of watching her slowly wither and die. I had no idea. The last year had been such a good one. And then I came back from my conference and she was gone, instantly and forever. She'd made sure to tie up all the loose ends and make it as easy for me to deal with her affairs as possible. And then she took a handful of pills and died. Geneva looked at Carrigan and didn't say anything for a long while. "You found her?" "I found her," he replied, and his eyes ached with the memory of that day. The strange smell in the kitchen, the sound of blackbirds shrieking, a certain foreboding on opening the door. "It doesn't get worse than that," he said, and looked up and let out a dry, choked laugh. "At least, I hope to Christ it doesn't." She passed him the bottle, and he took a sip and looked into her eyes, and knew now was the time to broach the subject. "Since we're getting personal and confessional and all that crap, I'd really like to know what's going on with you at the moment, Geneva. And I'm not talking about what happened tonight." "Nothing," she said, her body turning into shadow and angle. "Nothing in particular." The droop of her eyes and curve of lip told him this was somewhere she didn't want to go. "You don't have to tell me anything. Your life is your life, absolutely. But I know there's something bothering you. Something serious. I'd like to think that in the last year we've developed some trust, maybe enough to be able to share these things." It took her a long time to answer, and when she did, she said, "Are you asking as my boss or as a friend?" "Whichever you prefer." "I think tonight a friend is what I need," she replied, and told him about Oliver. The whole sad story, the solicitor's letters piling up on her table, and darkly whispered threats against her mother. "Bastard," Carrigan said. "You want me to talk to him?" "Thanks," she replied, hiding her surprise and shaking her head. "I appreciate the offer, but this is something I need to do for myself." "Have you thought about hiring your own lawyer?" Geneva laughed coldly. "That's exactly what he wants me to do. He's a lawyer. He can keep this going for as long as he wants, and there's no way I can afford that.
He knows he'll win either way. He wouldn't have proposed it otherwise. She got up and weaved unsteadily as she made her way to the kitchen, coming back with 2 large glasses of water. I know it's asking a lot, but if you could stay, I just don't want to be alone tonight. Carrigan took the glass and nodded. The sofa looks comfy enough. Her smile unfroze, and he saw relief tear through her face. Besides, I'm going to stay up for a bit. I don't get much sleep these days. She thanked him again and said good night, and disappeared down the small dark corridor, and the room felt colder and smaller without her. After a while, he got up and moved the armchair so it faced the window. He stared up at the shadowed landscape, and there was no light nor sign of human habitation as far as the eye could see. Only a sky berserk with snow, and, behind him, somewhere, a woman sleeping in a bed, the light in the corridor the only illumination in all that rolling darkness of night. Chapter 31. Carrigan was waiting for his morning coffee to dispense when he felt a shadow fall over him. He looked up to see Carlson leaning up against the wall, smiling contentedly to himself. Yes? He had no time for this, not now. He could feel the rush of facts swirling inside his head, the leads multiplying and diverging, the need for more coffee, more time, the nagging awful sense that he was missing something. I was wondering where D.S. Miller was, Carlson said, in that fake nonchalant way you ask a question you already know the answer to. She's taken the morning off, Carrigan replied, hoping his voice didn't betray him. Carlson made a show of looking behind him, a quick glance back, then said, I didn't want to bring this up in front of everyone else, but I thought I ought to talk to you before I go any further with it. Carrigan snatched the drink from the dispenser, his fingers burning on the plastic cup, and tried to decipher Carlson's tone. He took a cautious sip and grimaced at the muddy taste of powdered coffee. I wish you'd just say what you mean, John. I've got no fucking time for playing games today. Carlson stepped closer, and all Carrigan could smell was his aftershave, spicy and pungent, like walking into the front of a department store. I am not playing games, believe me. I was just extending the courtesy of telling you before taking this hire. Carrigan crushed the cup in his hand and flung it into the bin. Taking what hire? What the fuck are you talking about? Carlson's voice dropped conspiratorially. I saw D.S. Miller yesterday, and she didn't seem right. For a brief moment, Carrigan wondered how Carlson had found out, then realised the sergeant meant something entirely different. I'd keep my eye on her, if I were you, Carlson continued, scratching his cheek and flashing his gums. Wouldn't want the brass to find out one of your detectives arrived at work drunk. Guess that's why she had to take the morning off. What did you just say? Carrigan felt his fingers clenching, a bright, sharp twitch blossoming in his left shoulder. The other day, she came back from lunch reeking of booze. Don't tell me you haven't noticed her recent mood swings. If you don't report it, then I will. Which means I'll also have to report you for not reporting it once I'd informed you of the situation. Carrigan was about to say something, then realised there was nothing he could say. Carlson had him. Either he passed on this info about Geneva to the super and betrayed her trust, or he'd be up in front of Branch himself. He pulled his hands out of his pockets, turned towards Carlson, and slammed him against the coffee machine. He saw the raw shock in Carlson's eyes. You have no idea what she's been through. He realised almost immediately it had been the wrong thing to say, by the subtle shift in the sergeant's expression. You seem very eager to defend her, Carlson replied, recovering his grin. She's part of the team. I'd do the same for any of you. You sure it's just that?
That it's not personal? After all, you both arrived in the same car this morning. You, Carrigan, were wearing the same clothes as yesterday and looked as if you hadn't slept. If I were a detective, I'd surmise you spent the night at her place.
Carrigan pushed Carlson hard against the drinks machine. Images of Geneva flashed before his eyes. Geneva curled up on the wet pavement, the phone she'd called him from still clutched in both hands. The stumble in her words as she told him what had happened. He blinked, and he was back in the room, his hands locked around Carlson's neck, fingers pressing deep. "You ever do something like that again, and you're finished," he said. But he was out of breath, and the words came out faint and false.
"You are fucking finished if you're covering up for her."
Carrigan's fist crashed into Carlson's jaw at the same moment that the door to the refreshment room was flung open.
"What in fuck's name is going on here?"
Carrigan turned and saw Branch standing in the doorframe, his mouth hanging half open, his eyes blazing behind smudged glasses. "Nothing," Carrigan said, moving a step back, trying to force the adrenaline down, his eyes never leaving Carlson's.
"Nothing?" Branch repeated.
He shook his head as he entered the room.
"What do you have to say about this, D.S. Carlson?"
Carlson rubbed his jaw, his eyes lingering for a long moment on Carrigan, then turning to Branch.
"Oh, it's nothing, sir. Just a few flared tempers." "Jesus Christ! Now you're both lying to me."
Branch shook his head in dismay and disgust.
"Carrigan, my office now, and you, Sergeant, go and clean yourself up for God's sake. You look like some yobbo on the wrong end of a Friday night."
Branch didn't say anything as Carrigan followed him through the winding corridor and into his office. The super sat down, unclipped his phone, and began texting furiously. The buzzer on his table lit up. He looked at Carrigan.
"Just make yourself presentable. Quinn's due any moment."
Carrigan ran his fingers through his hair and adjusted his shirt and tie, all the time watching Branch texting on 2 phones at once. The door opened and ACC Quinn came in, dressed in a gravestone grey pinstripe, snowflakes melting on his shoulders and eyebrows.
"Carrigan,"
he said as Branch got up and gave the ACC his seat.
"Good of you to come in.
I know this investigation is keeping you busy, so I won't delay you long." He cleared the front of the desk, pushing papers and phones aside, and laid his arms across it. "So, where are we on this? Please tell me you're about to wrap it up. The press are becoming intolerable, and I'm getting calls from Whitehall every morning." Carrigan took a deep breath, still rattled and adrenaline jumpy from the fight. Quinn was staring expectantly at him. Even at the start, Carrigan had known the case would come down to such moments, but it didn't make it any easier now.
"We're following some promising leads, but it's a lot more complex than we first thought."
Quinn wrinkled his brow. "What's so complicated?" "Someone set the fire, and you need to catch that person." Carrigan sighed inwardly. It was always like this with the brass, as if they'd forgotten everything they'd learned on the street or had it surgically removed on promotion. "We have no forensic evidence of any use. The fire made sure of that, so the only way we're going to catch who did this is by knowing why they did it." "The motive will lead us to the suspect," he said, noticing his voice turning defensive, hating it, but unable to control it. Quinn sniffed and tapped one finger 3 times on the surface of the table. "OK, Carrigan. Explain it to me. Pretend I'm some idiot who can barely string a sentence together and tell me what we have." "We're trying to work out why Emily Maxted, the 11th victim, was at the convent that particular night, and what her connection to the nuns is. We're interviewing her ex-boyfriend later today, and he may shed some light on this." He saw Quinn wrinkle his brow and continued, "The more we look into the convent's affairs, the more anomalies we find, and the diocese is being less than helpful with our inquiries." Carrigan stopped and waited a beat, knowing his timing had to be just right. "We're trying to figure out if the nuns' political activities in South America in the early 1970s have anything to do with the fire. They were also involved in neighbourhood clean-up schemes that may have pissed off a local dealer, Dimitar Duca," Carrigan said, noticing how each new piece of information produced a different physical reaction in Quinn, his jaw tightening, eyelids fluttering, lips twitching and pursing. They were also embroiled in a dispute with the diocese. The entire convent was on the verge of being excommunicated, and we're looking into that too. "Enough!" Quinn slammed his palm down on the table, a hard, resounding crack that made Branch jump almost an inch off his chair. "I wish I could just press a button and go back in time and not have heard any of that. But we can't do that, can we? And you, Carrigan, can't go around flinging about wild rumours and innuendos, hoping something will stick. These nuns have suffered enough, and now you want to besmirch their reputation and drag it through the dirt?" Carrigan kept his mouth shut, having expected this and counted on it. "And now I'm getting calls from the diocese's press secretary saying you treated him like a suspect and that 2 of your men gained unauthorized entry into the archives." "Women," Carrigan said. "What?" They were women, not men. Quinn's eyes turned narrow and dark. "You're walking a very high wire here, Carrigan. I would advise you not to look down." Quinn paused, his hands entrenched in his jacket pockets. "Desist on the nuns. Understand me? No more digging up the past. That's not going to lead you to the arsonist. You mentioned the nuns pissing off a drug dealer. What's your feeling about that?" Carrigan leaned forward, knowing the time had come, trying to keep his face blank and neutral, trying not to think about what the men had done to Geneva last night. "Very much in the picture, sir," he replied. "I'd like to shift the investigation's focus to Duca. We've had certain developments over the last couple of days that point strongly in his direction." "So why aren't you focusing your energies on Duca rather than digging up dirt on the nuns?" Carrigan shrugged. "We're not equipped to deal with that. I need a clear remit and no interference from the drug squad or organised crime. I need more overtime allocations, surveillance vehicles, an armed response team at the ready, and more uniforms. I also need my warrants to be fast-tracked so the trail doesn't go cold. These people are highly sophisticated and electronically aware. We need to move fast on any info we get." Quinn scratched his cheek and looked at Branch, then back to Carrigan. "And if you had all this, you'd be prioritising Duca and not the nuns?" "Yes, sir. With these added resources, I can pile some pressure on him and his business." Quinn put his hands together, closed his eyes and nodded. "OK, Carrigan. Send my secretary a list of what you need, and I'll make sure you get it. And for God's sake, do something about that hideous black eye. It's very unbecoming in a policeman." Quinn gave a curt nod, stood up, brushed the creases from his suit, and left the office. "Why do I get the feeling you just let him play into your hand?" Branch was staring at Carrigan, his expression somewhat unreadable, maybe even a little amused. "I have no idea why you'd think that, sir." Chapter 32. "Can you please stop asking if I'm okay?" She turned back just in time to see the oncoming bus hurtling towards them. With a quick flick of her wrist, she pulled the car out of danger at the last possible moment. Carrigan gripped the edges of his seat and felt a trickle of sweat run down the back of his neck. "I'm sorry." "And stop saying you're sorry." It had been like this since morning. A cold, hard wall had formed around her, layers of silence. She seemed veiled in shock, as if she were watching him and the road ahead at one remove. He was going to tell her about his altercation with Carlson, but decided against it. Perhaps it was better she didn't know yet. There were still a few cards he had left to play, and maybe the issue could be resolved before she found out. He sat back and kept his mouth shut and watched the silent ballet of last-minute shoppers through his window. Trussed-up bodies trudging wearily through the clumpy streets, the snow turned from wonder to nuisance almost overnight. DC Singh looked through Emily's Facebook site, Geneva said, as they stopped at a red light. Carrigan nodded, happy to change the subject, and happy that someone else was doing this, knowing how lost he was in the electronic mesh and sprawl of lives on the internet. And nothing. Not for almost 2 years. Before that, apparently she was quite active, used her site to organise protest marches and online petitions against this or that corporation, and then it all stops dead. Just like the nuns' charity work. Yes, but the timing doesn't match. The nuns stopped their outreach work a year ago. Emily went off the net about 20 months ago. Singh said Emily wasn't following any religious organisations, and when she cross-checked her friends list with the convents, there wasn't any overlap. It's a connection even if we don't yet understand it. Carrigan looked at Geneva, noticing how crumpled she appeared. A tightening of her muscles and a persistent tick below her right eye, the small betrayals of her body. We need to find out what happened to Emily in the last year. We need to know what steps she took that brought her into collision with the nuns, but, having said that, I think we need to be very careful with Emily. She was involved with the nuns, possibly stayed at the convent and was there that night, but I'm not so sure her presence has anything to do with the fire. A few days ago you were sure Emily was the key. I know, he admitted. I've changed my mind. The facts have changed. We still need to find out more about Emily. I'm not quite ready to drop her yet. We'll talk to her ex-boyfriend, see what he has to say, but we need to be careful we don't let a good story get in the way of evidence. Geneva found a parking space outside Jeff Shorter's office. After what Donna Maxted had told him, Carrigan had been surprised that Shorter had no criminal record, but even more so by the fact that he now owned his own business. The offices of Green Solutions were situated above an exclusive children's clothes store on Kensington High Street. Carrigan glanced in the window and saw a toddler's gingham dress that cost more than his entire wardrobe put together. He stood in the swirling snow and watched the blanketed streets as Geneva smoked a hurried cigarette. Despite her reservations, he felt a quickening as he walked up to the front door. He looked at Geneva climbing the stairs behind him and wondered what was going through her head. The woman who opened the door had clearly been expecting someone else, and she didn't bother to hide her disappointment at the sight of them. She looked like she had only left school yesterday, all zits, puppy fat, and a blank, bored expression. She wore a dark black blouse and black miniskirt, her hair cut short and severe, and she smelled of hairspray and the chewing gum she was pounding between her teeth. "Jeff's busy in a meeting?" She tapped something on her iPhone with a long, false nail. "Maybe you should come back after Christmas?" "Thanks for your help," Carrigan said, walking straight past her up the stairs and through the lobby into Shorter's office. Jeff Shorter had his legs up on the desk and was watching a cricket match taking place in some hot, dusty city half a world away. His eyes shot up when they entered, lingering a second longer on Geneva, then went back to the game. Carrigan heard the announcer's flat voice running off statistics, batting tallies and legendary stands from times long gone. He saw a jug of Pimm's on the desk, 3 thumbed and ragged copies of Wisden, various papers and scrawled notes, a disarranged set of playing cards, and a laptop. "We need to talk to you about Emily Maxted," Carrigan said, studying Shorter, trying to gauge his reaction. But the man's face was impassive and bland, impossible to read, his eyes fixed dreamily on the screen in front of him. Shorter's hair had receded halfway up his skull. To compensate, he had grown what was left into a shaggy blonde afro, and he now ran his hand across it, as if to make sure it was still there.
Emily? God! I haven't heard from her for ages. How is she?
Emily was killed in a fire 5 days ago. They both watched carefully as Shorter processed the information. His eyes flicked from Carrigan to Geneva, then his eyebrows shot up, and he began to laugh, a series of semi-articulated ha-has emerging from deep in his throat.
She put you up to this, didn't she? I sincerely hope you're not going to start stripping now.
Carrigan kept his mouth tight.
No, Mr. Shorter, I'm not going to strip, rest assured. But this isn't a joke. Emily is dead, and we're investigating the circumstances surrounding her death.
Shorter had been rocking back on his chair, and now he stopped, using his arms to anchor himself to the desk.
Emily? Dead?
He looked down at the papers and printouts and shook his head.
I knew it, he whispered. I knew it would end like this.
Carrigan and Geneva exchanged looks. The more people they spoke to, the more it seemed that Emily had fulfilled the destiny everyone expected of her. It was only the location and circumstance that surprised them. Shorter was silent for a couple of minutes, facing away, and when he turned round they could tell he had been crying. "How long were you and Emily together?" Geneva asked, moving her chair just a little forward of Carrigan's. They'd agreed in the car that she would lead, and the way Shorter's gaze tracked the line of her cleavage only confirmed that decision. Shorter quickly looked away and stared at the glass of Pimm's in his hand, as if surprised to find it there.
We were together about 11 years, give or take. We met at Leeds, then moved down here.
He downed the remains of his drink.
What happened to her?
We'll get to that, Geneva replied. Shorter glanced up, then back down at his hands.
Do I need a lawyer? He said.
Carrigan and Geneva looked at each other, blood beating in their eyes. Why would you think you need a lawyer? Geneva asked. Shorter shook his head, his hands fidgeting at his sides.
I don't know if I should be talking to you, he said.
Well, that's entirely up to you, Mr. Shorter. But if you decide to do that, we'll have to arrest you on suspicion of the murder of Emily Maxted. Carrigan knew they had nowhere near enough evidence to do that, but the look in Shorter's face told him it wouldn't get that far.
Murder?
Shorter looked momentarily disoriented, as if waking to find himself in a strange bed. Someone murdered Emily. His voice turned high and crackly.
That's not why I didn't want to talk to you. I don't know anything about that.
Then why?
You're only interested in Emily's murder.
Yes?
Because if I tell you about Emily and me, well, some of the